Uncut Gems has had a big release in the US via A24 and is coming out on Netflix basically everywhere else very soon, but it's currently on a very limited release in the UK, so I finally got to see a Safdie film on the big screen. And what a treat it was. The hype is real, forget the Oscars. Uncut Gems is one of the most gut-wrenching, nail-biting thrillers in recent times, as well as a very clever and very funny character comedy. Howard Ratner is a jeweler working in New York. With a string of celebrities wearing his horrible bedazzled jewellery, Howard is comfortably well off. But it's not enough. He wants more and has bet everything on a huge uncut gem, a black opal smuggled to him by Ethiopian miners. He thinks he can sell it for a great profit, but he hasn't bargained on Kevin Garnett, Boston Celtics player, deciding it's his new good luck charm. That interaction sets off a chain of catastrophic events. Writer-directors Josh and Benny Safdie, known as the Safdie brothers, are rising at a rate of knots. It's hard to think that just a few movies back, they were doing guerrilla DIY stuff on the streets of New York, and now they've graduated to, well, sort of the same, but with a much glossier look and actors you actually know. If you're interested in finding out more about their films, you can see Good Time starring Robert Pattinson on Netflix currently. I also made a video for Little White Lies about it, which I will link in the description. Uncut Gems is very much in line with their previous work. At its heart, it's really a comedy, albeit a very tragic one. Everything that goes wrong for Howard is his own fault, and he consistently screws things up for himself. Indeed, unlike most thrillers, you're really on the edge of your seat because you're hoping that the protagonist won't make things worse for himself. Howard will make sudden decisions that seem almost inexplicable, yet make sense for his character in retrospect. It's clever and deep character writing that's aided by a fantastic performance from Sandler. He constantly wears this cheap, meaningless grin. He's childish, he lies through his teeth, and he feels hard done by despite his wealth. He repeats the same phrases like a tick, his loyalties are unclear all the time, and he doesn't seem to care about anyone. Throughout the film, it feels like Howard is making decisions, realizing things about himself, just as he goes along. He's the ultimate impulsive character, and he's compelled by this deep need not just to survive, but to win, to prove himself better than others. And the biggest joke of the movie is that Howard fucking sucks. No one likes him, not even his own wife, and especially not himself. He's a total failure of a human being, almost bereft of positive characteristics, and yet is incredibly compelling to watch because you have no idea how far he will push things, push himself. Now, the secret to making a plot like this work and making the audience want to watch someone as repulsive as Howard is the film craft, the aesthetic approach being used. The Safdie's films are intense, all capitals all the time. Their camera is always tight on faces, almost always moving. If there's a wide, it'll be far back and above the characters, looking down on them like all of their suffering is predetermined. And the sound is always rising. You're watching a scene struggling to track the 2 or 3 people speaking, often about different topics, and suddenly a phone will ring and a door will buzz and another person will start yelling. A man pours Gatorade in the fish tank just to get someone's attention, and all you can see on screen is a harried man clearly about to break while smiling a very fake smile. There's no doubt about it, it's a lot, and it's divisive as a style, but watching it, I can't help but think the Safdies are amongst the first filmmakers to really understand the 21st century and show it on screen. Howard is besieged by information. He's surrounded by TV screens and phones and texts, and yet he's totally unable to communicate. In a rare, quiet moment, he hides in his mistress's apartment and sends her some sext messages, then watches her reaction. And that's how Howard sees himself in his interactions with the world and his displays of wealth or power. His world only makes sense through the hustle, and he really sees himself as a little man punching up. But to anyone who sees his beautiful house and his family, who admittedly he's screwed his relationships with, his life just seems like a missed opportunity for happiness. And this resonance with real life is amplified by a number of clever conceits that place Uncut Gems squarely in our world, not least of which, of course, is the presence of Kevin Garnett and the key plot-critical role a number of real-life basketball games from the 2012 NBA season play in the film. But that's the world in which Howard thrives. He's a man who cannot stop talking, whose trade is in bedazzled Furbies and Michael Jackson crucifixes, these meaningless symbols of wealth that exist purely for show. It's clear from one of the film's opening moments, where the camera flies through a galaxy-like space within the Uncut Gem, only to slowly zoom out of Howard's colonoscopy footage. For all the wonder and magic in the world, we literally begin the film up Howard's arse. I'm almost done. I'm winding up the review, I promise, but I want to give you something to chew on. When I was doing the research for the Little White Lies video, I found a quote about the Safdie brothers' first film, The Pleasure of Being Robbed. It's from a slant review by a writer called Nick Shager. He said that the film was a preeminent example of what happens when filmmaking tools become accessible to people with nothing to say. I think he's kind of right. In a sense, what the Safdies are saying about the 21st century is precisely that. For a lot of people, there is nothing to say, no sense at all to make of life. Shager said that if the filmmakers are the future of American independent film, then perhaps consideration should be given to blowing the whole thing up. And I think that's exactly what the Safdie brothers have done, albeit not quite in the way that Shager would have thought. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to find out what you thought about Uncut Gems. I know it hasn't had that wider release in the UK yet. In fact, it's been really a criminally small release, and it's the kind of film you would hope would go out in cinemas in a wider way, but such is life. As long as the cinema chains keep resisting Netflix and Amazon, then that's going to continue to be the case. But anyway, I will be monitoring these comments when the film is on Netflix as well, so let's have a conversation about Uncut Gems, one of the most interesting and cool, I think, movies that I've seen in recent times. Have a good one. Bye for now. Every now and again, a new genre can creep up on you unannounced, and before you know it, there's a full body of work you don't recognize until you join the dots. That's what happened to me when I watched Dark Waters and realized that the Mark Ruffalo investigates institutional corruption procedural thriller is a real thing. Ruffalo plays Robert Bilott, a corporate lawyer working for American chemical companies. He's approached by a West Virginia farmer through a family connection to the area. The man's cattle keep dying and acting strange. He thinks it has something to do with the DuPont chemical plant just upriver. Bilott investigates further and is drawn into an unprecedented industrial pollution scandal that threatens his job, his reputation, even his health. Directed by Todd Haynes, this is essentially a legal procedural that plays out like a thriller, and it's shot like one too. Ruffalo inhabits this murky, cold steel world where the skies are always overcast and fluorescent-lit offices are dusty and drab. Within that framework, Haynes humanizes this massive, slow-motion ecological disaster, finding small elements of character in how the story unfolds. On Bilott's first visit to the farmer, Wilbur Tennant, Wilbur brings him into his house and shows him a collection of foil-wrapped animal parts, including tumors and blackened teeth. He's unwrapping them, some pickled, some drawn out of his freezer, and places them on the living room table. In the background of the reverse shot on Ruffalo, you can see the man's teenage daughters coming downstairs to watch, see what's happening, why is this stranger in their house? And in the adjoining kitchen, Tennant's wife watches while washing up. It's a really well-observed moment that grounds this huge crisis in one man's kitchen. The issue is so present for him that his dining table is the perfect place to explain it, but simultaneously the biological horror of what's happening is so at odds with this domestic setting. Tennant is central to the film. He's played by Bill Camp in a very rough and abrasive role that's excellently realised. He's at 100% intensity in his very first scene, and then slowly this is dialed down. You realise that you're meeting him when he is at the peak of years of fighting this big chemical company. There's a warmth and humanity displayed in the film towards the victims of this disaster, the people of these small towns in West Virginia, and Haynes' wonderful human touch is perfect for bringing that out. But it is a legal drama primarily, and there's plenty of little details to dig in on. Early on, DuPont tries to flood Bilott with boxes and boxes of requested records and paperwork. They send so much that there are Christmas cards from the 1950s in there. Between the paperwork, bad cell phone reception, and a loving close-up of Windows 2000 Professional Edition starting up, the film signposts its timeline very clearly, giving a great sense of just how long the case took. On the sidelines in all this is Anne Hathaway, playing Rob's wife Sarah. Herself a lawyer who gave up work to care for their children, her insight and motivation provides support at key moments. These movies often have a subplot where the sad wife sits at home and the guy's relationship falls apart because he's too focused on his work. It's simplistic and rote, and it mostly shows just how prevalent the POV of mostly male screenwriters is. Women are passive obstacles to important work taking place, apparently. Sarah's role kind of goes back and forth on this. At times she fits that to a T, but the depth of her character and her presence in much of the investigation makes it feel more realistic like normal character interaction. She's exasperated at times, sure, but wouldn't you be after 15 years of getting nowhere? It doesn't just feel like a lazy plot device, and that's aided by Hathaway's well-judged performance. The film has a good sense of how momentum can build behind a cause as well. There's a righteous sense of anger that lingers after the film stops rolling. It's the kind of true story movie that makes you Google everything afterwards just to work out what's still happening and what you can do about it. Now, I don't think the film and the filmmaking in it is going to set the world on fire, but it's a great dramatization of an important episode in our industrial history, told with a humanistic touch that elevates it slightly above the rest of the similar films in that kind of genre. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to have a chat with you in the comments below about this movie. Are you a massive Todd Haynes stan, or are you, like me, always here for a Mark Ruffalo movie? Have a good one. Bye for now. Charles Dickens, you've heard of him, I'm guessing. I'll tell you now that I've never read Dickens, so I went into this with just the kind of like cereal box information on the man, the sort of pop cultural osmosis that you get about a figure from watching Muppets versions of stuff they wrote. Indeed, my only understanding of David Copperfield even comes from the BBC miniseries that Daniel Radcliffe did in the late 90s. I would have been about 8 years old when I watched it, so don't look to me for judging textual accuracy. But textual accuracy and this film have a curious relationship. It'll no doubt draw a lot of interest and probably a lot of attacks for prominently featuring people of colour in main roles, not least Dev Patel as David Copperfield himself. This isn't the slightly awkward, how do we explain this casting style either. Director Armando Iannucci and casting director Sarah Crowe have decided to completely ignore any sort of justification. There are white characters with black mothers and vice versa. Stuff like that. It fits well with a general approach of irreverence and postmodernity that will come as no surprise to viewers familiar with Iannucci's other work, like The Death of Stalin, Alan Partridge, and Time Trumpet. The film begins with David Copperfield reading his life story to a gathered audience in a playhouse. That scenery then becomes the film as it starts, with Copperfield's birth narrated by him in person, literally standing there watching it happen. A carriage bursts into his bedroom to transition into another scene. His idyllic early childhood is interrupted by a hand crashing through the ceiling, becoming a pencil sketch taken away and scrunched up. Even the dialogue does it. Characters mock each other's very Dickensian names. These postmodern touches encourage the viewer to approach what might be viewed as a sacred text in some quarters in a more lively way, and it also opens up the story to some moments of absurd humour. Unfortunately, the flip side of this is that the dialogue can often be quite bold. It explains things very plainly, and combined with frequent wide and mid shots, all the better for improvising, I have to assume, it can feel a bit simple, a little childish. It's not aided by the very episodic structure early on, where Copperfield is shuttled from weird character to weird character, each of whom is played by a well-known British actor, admittedly all doing pretty good work. As I understand it, that's not really Iannucci's fault. After all, Dickens was basically writing as he went along, and for a serialized purpose as well, so you have to keep the audience hooked. Unfortunately, it makes it hard to care about the story or Copperfield's fortunes until the plot settles down in the second half, fully an hour into the film. It just feels a bit rushed, and that's exacerbated by plenty of comedic rushing, you know, where actors run around to do a big funny, as if being faster might make the laughs louder. All in all, it's quite a clever and radical adaptation. Iannucci and writer Simon Blackwell make quite a few big changes to the story that interact with and are justified by their interesting postmodern conceits. The casting of people of colour in lead roles also lends another angle to some of the themes of the story. In particular, Copperfield's changing identity as he is named and renamed has some interesting additional dimensions. Unfortunately, in my book, a film can be very, very interesting and still not good. I think there's plenty to like in the film, but it's by no means a classic. Still, it'd be great to have more radical period films and classic literature adaptations. Dickens is a good place to start, as he was a pretty radical writer in his time. That's it from me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this interesting but not good film in the comments below. Let's chat about weird period films and clever adaptations as well. This really reminded me of Michael Winterbottom's Tristram Shandy from about a decade back. Or, you know, we could just talk about the movie or literally anything. I don't know, it's the comments. Do what you want. That's it from me. Have a good one. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Lloyd Vogel, Matthew Rhys, is a cynical investigative reporter plagued by conflict with his dad, Chris Cooper, that's exacerbated by having a baby son. In need of some insight into his life, it's a happy coincidence that he's assigned to profile a famous kids' TV presenter, Mr. Rogers, played by Tom Hanks. Determined to find a dark secret in Rogers' life, Lloyd begins to be transformed by the positive influence of this legendary American pop culture presence. A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood leans heavily on the legacy of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the kids' TV show that it revolves around. The film's intro is a cunning reconstruction of the opening titles of that show, and several interludes have Hanks in character as Rogers, explaining essentially the plot of the film to the audience. That's integral to the fabric of the film. It's as much about the comforting rituals of that show and Hanks's kind of spot-on characterization of Rogers as it is about Lloyd's emotional journey. Now that's a little hard for me to get my head around. I'm from the UK, I never watched Mr. Rogers growing up, and there's no real cultural equivalent here. I can't imagine there being a feature film based around Blue Peter, for instance. As a result, some of this stuff feels a little weird at first. I'm not being reminded of a cultural legacy, but actually introduced to it for the first time. So Hanks speaking to camera for long periods of time is, frankly, a little unnerving. I hope this isn't. Happily, the film settles into its groove and focuses on the emotional story at its heart, which is touching and well performed. Lloyd meets Rogers at his studio, where everything runs behind because the guy is very nice but also a perfectionist, and this is our introduction to Hanks as Rogers. He's by turns impish and kooky, sincere and quiet. Slowly throughout the film, he peels back the layers of that character. It's a complex performance of a figure with a lot of expectations around him. It helps that the film has a lot of fun with Rogers as a character. In one scene, his mere presence on a subway makes everyone spontaneously sing the theme song to the show. It's like he's so nice, he's basically a very cozy reality warper. These sections work better than the continued TV show interludes, which can feel a little gimmicky with their vintage cameras, and a little too scattershot to be really effective. Now, with all the talking about feelings that Rogers does, the film is very emotional, but not in a sappy Hollywood way, sentimental as you might expect. Basically, it focuses on Lloyd's relationship with his dad thawing out over a difficult period of interpersonal conflict. Rogers quickly cottons onto that and begins to try and kind of support Lloyd through that experience. Rhys communicates a quite internal character arc in the film. Lloyd is clearly shocked at how present and thoughtful Rogers is, and how intentional he is in how he approaches his life and its challenges, and that begins to change him. It means that for all the fuzziness of the kid show that it plays with, the film has some hard emotional truths in it. At one point, Lloyd presses Rogers heavily on any difficulties he's had, searching for this kind of dark secret in his life, and Rogers replies, saddened, that no normal life is free of pain. It's a sensitive, wholesome treatment of difficult emotional territory, and because of its focus on talking about problems, it also invites the audience to be open with their feelings. I cried, basically for the last 15 minutes of the film, mostly because the movie made me feel like it was okay to express that. It invited me as a viewer to open up and be vulnerable. A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood leans a little heavily on the audience's understanding of its subject, and has a few too many gimmicks in it. But underneath, it's a heartfelt, gentle comedy where two grown men talk about their feelings for a few hours, and honestly, I think we could do with more of those. That's it from me, but I'm really interested in hearing what you thought about the film, particularly if you're from the States and grew up with Mr. Rogers, because I have no idea what this would be like for people who have that experience. Have a good one. Bye for now.
What's a timberman want with being a wickie?
Just looking to earn a living, just like any man. Starting new.
On the run.
After his sensational debut film The Witch, where a small family of Puritans in their isolated farm are besieged by supernatural forces, director Robert Eggers seems to want to one-up himself here with an even smaller cast and a more isolated setting. You have Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe playing a pair of lighthouse keepers who turn increasingly unhinged when their relief fails to show up. The film's immediately striking in how stylistically austere it is. It's shot on grainy black and white 35mm film with vintage lenses, and it's framed in this boxy, confined ratio. The blocking for characters is very precise too. Plenty of the film is just the two leads walking around this narrow, claustrophobic lighthouse. For example, in an early scene, Pattinson is pacing about, kind of establishing the geography of the place. He heads upstairs and he thuds his head on the low ceiling in the bedroom that he shares with Defoe. There's a pillar in the middle of the room that blocks out the window, so there's this kind of gloomy space. He sits on a bed on the left of the screen, and then Defoe emerges from behind the pillar in the middle of the screen. You didn't even know he was there. There's plenty of clever, even tricksy visual language like that in the film, and it's aided by the rhythmic edit and the sound design. The foghorn never stops sounding, the engines judder on, the wind howls. It all adds up to this intensely foreboding tone, something portentous. There's this horrific sense that something is coming, that something is already here maybe, that something is very, very wrong. The visual language of the film is specific then, but the character's language even more so. Eggers researched the vocabulary and the accents of the script extensively, really nailing a specific time and place, which in this case is New England in the 1800s. That sense of place does wonders for the film, which should come as no surprise to fans of The Witch, which used a heavily researched Puritan's dialect to similar effect. You feel transported to the era, to the place, and there's something almost pre-technological about it, which fits well with the horror elements of the film, in which something ancient and old is bothering Pattinson. That's not a horrific creature, bear in mind, although there are plenty of Lovecraft-adjacent images in the film. The real issue is his physical body, his denied connection to its pleasures, and his working pains. Very old problems indeed. The film's full of snatched moments of sexual imagery. Pattinson picks at a hole in his mattress, pulls out a carving of a mermaid. He looks through a hole in the roof as Defoe humps his bed in his sleep. Every other waking moment is toil, which is deeply lovingly portrayed. Here's Pattinson dragging oil up a spiral staircase one step at a time, for instance. In the night, the film's astonishing and overtly supernatural imagery comes in with these visions of roiling tentacles and beckoning mermaids. Now, how real any of this is ultimately left up for grabs, but the clear context is one of sexuality and resentment intermingling, about to boil over. Eggers' film never lets up and never runs out of steam, building to a thrilling climax that, like the rest of the film, is as rigid in its stylistic approach as it is loose in its application of dream logic. If you can get into the groove of Eggers' very specific approach, very strict approach to filmmaking, if you can put yourself in the mindset of those mysterious but well-drawn characters, The Lighthouse will prove a very illuminating experience. Terrible, that sounded better in my head. That's all I can really say without spoiling the movie, so I'm going to leave it there, but I do highly recommend you watch The Lighthouse if you can see it on its very limited run in the UK. That's it from me, but because no one else I know has seen the movie, I would love to have a chat with you in the comments below about it. It's so rich and full of suggestion and imagery that I think there's a lot for us to discuss, so hopefully I'll see you there. Have a good one, bye for now. Parasite is sweeping the awards, selling out cinemas around the world, and it's finally landed in the UK. It follows the Kims, a down-on-their-luck Korean family struggling to pay the rent on their semi-basement flat while working part-time jobs. All that changes when son Ki-woo is offered a job by an old friend. Go and teach English to the daughter of a rich family, the Parks. One by one, the Kims lie and manipulate their way into an array of jobs in the Park household, operating under assumed identities that are unrelated to each other.
제시카 외동딸 일리노이 시카고 과선배는 김치모 그는 이사촌.
This comedy plot, with its heady mix of farce and social realism, is already a great setup for a movie, but all is not what it seems in the Park house, and the film takes a very unexpected turn. To say more would spoil the surprise, so I'll get into spoilers later in the film with a very clear warning. But for now, let's talk about the movie in a spoiler-free way. Parasite is the latest film from director Bong Joon-ho, whose previous films Snowpiercer, Okja, The Host, Mother, and Memories of Murder have all offered very interesting subversions of genre elements, while also focusing on social commentary in a big way. If you're interested in finding out more about his work, check out my beginner's guide on Little White Lies, linked in the description and in a card right here. Bong has got a bit of a reputation for showy films with a weird central premise. Parasite mostly bucks that trend by remaining relatively grounded, and in that sense is much more like Memories of Murder than the worldwide super pig antics of Okja, for instance. But the rich character writing present across all his films is very much on display here, with the relatively limited cast carefully brought to life. The Kims, for instance, all have distinct speech patterns and ways of coping with their difficult situation, and the Parks likewise have interesting separate personalities. Here's where the all-star Korean cast is on great form. It's impossible to pick out a single actor that does better than another. It's a real team effort. And importantly, I think their chemistry is also believable, and it lends additional depth to the film's interactions. You can see that in the differing interactions between Ki-taek and Chung-suk, the parents in the Kim family, and Dong-ik and Yeon-kyo, the parents in the Park family. The Kims fight a lot, but they have an easy rapport that shows the importance of their struggles together. The Parks, in contrast, barely share screen time, and what time they have together is stilted, difficult, performative. All that wonderful acting stuff means that the characters avoid becoming caricatures, which is really important when you're dealing with sensitive and difficult political themes as the film does. At its heart, it's about how working poverty can brutalize people. It's portrayed as killing the ability to plan long term, shutting off empathy, making people desperate. The wealthy characters, in contrast, are naive, fake, and they're kind of harsh. They screw over lives on a whim with little provocation. But the film's depth of characterization means that it doesn't feel didactic, and interactions between the two families develop in surprising ways. None of this would be as interesting without the wonderful craft of the film. Both the Park and Kim family homes are amazingly fully built on sound stages, with seamless digital work completing the backgrounds. I wouldn't have known about that if I hadn't been told. It's really a triumph of production design and visual effects. It's helped by the masterful cinematography, which, as is typical for a Bong Joon-ho directed film, jumps about with plenty of long tracking and overhead shots. The quality of light in the film is interesting too. It's really naturalistic, and again, it's a game of contrasts really between the dingy Kim home and the ultra-modern, light and airy Park home. Above all, the edit really stood out to me. There's a number of clever montages in the film that work marvels with displaying the at times complicated plottings of the Kim family, and simultaneously it provides great laughs at the expense of the Parks. But importantly, the film's as comfortable with its comedic moments as it is with the more surprising stuff that goes on later on, and that's very much to do with the edit. The last thing I can say, spoiler-free, is that you should go watch Parasite, preferably in the cinema if you can, hopefully with mates, family, loved ones, or a general audience. The movie completely captured the sold-out screening I was in with plenty of laughs and gasps, and it's well worth the price of admission. After that, track down some other Bong Joon-ho stuff. I'm very partial to The Host. Now, spoilers will commence in 3, 2, 1. Cool. Welcome to spoiler territory. Once the Kims are well ensconced in the life of the Parks, they make a terrifying discovery. The former housekeeper who they ousted has been hiding her husband in a secret sub-basement for years. He's sort of mad, driven by isolation to considering Mr. Park as a godlike figure and trying to communicate with him via flickering light switches and Morse code. It's an astonishing turn of events that's handled with great skill by the director Bong Joon-ho. The creeping dread of the subtly off-kilter performance by that former housekeeper outside in the rain waiting to be let in, the rising action of the manic rush to hide everything before the Parks arrive home. It's an instant classic sequence of cinema. Throughout this latter part of the film, I couldn't help but think of it as kind of Hitchcockian. Bong is a big Hitchcock fan. He said so in the BAFTA Screenwriters Lecture, which I was lucky enough to attend and which you can see on their YouTube channel. The film's replete with foreshadowing, it has loads of callbacks, and there's a great sense of humour that's quite dry and character-driven. Then, in its second half, it takes a massive turn and becomes a suspense thriller, driven by these stunning visual set pieces, and suddenly what seemed funny isn't funny at all. That's just like Psycho or The Birds. What also happens in this latter half is that the political themes come to a fore in an intense way. That man who lives in the basement has been driven mad by poverty. He's forced to hide from mounting debts and loan sharks, and it transpires that his main source of difficulty was the closing of his shop, implied to be where Ki-taek worked years before. So they're both in similar situations, and that ultimately leads to Ki-taek taking his place after killing Mr. Park. Both men are blind to what's causing their problems though. The basement guy literally thinks of Mr. Park as a god, a kind of benevolent father. Key Tech, on the other hand, says that Parks are nice, although as his wife points out, it's not that hard to be nice if you're rich. He seems to be of the opinion that being poor is just because he hasn't worked hard enough yet. That if they can all get jobs, then they can work their way out of poverty. He certainly hopes for that for his kids. As the latter half develops, Key Tech twists into anger as he overhears what the Parks really think of him. It's well communicated through this recurring theme of his semi-basement smell, a problem that runs throughout the movie from its very first scene, if you remember, with the pizza boxes. He gets his own back in a way, but he's doomed to live underground as a result, just like the crazy basement guy. The ending gives pause for thought though. Ki-woo interprets his father's Morse code message, and we see a future where he's earned enough to buy the house and free his dad. I think that's easy to interpret as yet another aspirational story, where he works hard and finds freedom for his parents, which seems like almost a refutation of the rich-poor divide is entrenched themes of the rest of the film. But then again, it isn't the last moment of the movie. The last shot shows Ki-woo writing his letter explaining this plan, and as his dad says earlier in the film, life cannot be planned. That vision of freeing his dad is just that, a vision, an imagined moment. The reality is far from that hopeful future. That's it from me, but I know there's a lot to discuss about this movie in the comments, and I can't wait to talk about it with you. Stuff I'd love to discuss includes the significance of Native American imagery in the film, which really struck me, but I couldn't quite work out what that was there for. Your favourite moments in the movie, and of course your interpretation of the ending of the film and its themes. Have a good one. Bye for now. Harley Quinn emerged as a fan favourite out of the otherwise forgettable Suicide Squad, so it's no surprise that she's back with her own solo movie. Well, sort of solo. As you can tell, she's joined by a cast of female crime fighters from Gotham. But the real surprise here is that the film is pretty good. Birds of Prey and the fantabulous emancipation of one Harley Quinn, to give it its very long full title, sees Harley heartbroken after splitting with Mr. J for good. Even more unfortunate, she's no longer got the protection she enjoyed as his mole, and pretty soon her bad behaviour and past misdeeds means it's open season on Harley. That leads to her running afoul of Roman Sionis, aka Black Mask. Pretty soon everything's enjoyably tied up with 3 other women seeking to protect themselves and right wrongs. Renee Montoya, Dinah Lance aka Black Canary, and the Huntress. Oh, and a pickpocket, Cassandra Cain. As you might have guessed, there's a lot of moving parts in the plot, which sounds kind of like an Elmore Leonard novel when you remove the superhero names. All that intrigue, however, is pretty much just set dressing for the Harley Quinn show, mostly supplying reasons to move from one irreverent set piece to another. But there's nothing wrong with a thin plot as long as it makes sense, and luckily the film's more interested in having some fun. From an animated intro featuring nods to classic animated Harley and Cesar Ramiro's Joker, to a time-lapse drinking session in Roman's club, to a confetti-filled raid, Birds of Prey is constantly winking at its audience, and it wears its silly sense of humour as a kind of badge of honour. I've got to say that's kind of refreshing. It's a nice break from the stodgy, swollen epics Marvel's been pumping out recently. It also feels distinct from the rest of the DCEU, which matches with its mostly self-contained plot. There are a few references to Suicide Squad here and there, but it's nothing too involved or complex. That's all another data point in DC's increasing move away from MCU-style plot integration, which happily also helps the film to actually have some fun. It's good too that the film's fundamentals, its action sequences, are well in order, making inventive use of their settings and locations with some great fight choreography. Harley in this film is kind of a bit of a bruiser, and there's plenty of blood and broken limbs by the time the end credits are rolling. Slightly less successful are the out-and-out attempts at comedy with proper jokes and punchlines and stuff. Those can feel a bit forced and screechy, but the general atmosphere of levity means that the poppy fun of the heart of the film really lands. The cast is also enjoying themselves. Ewan McGregor's hammy Black Mask is a little bit hit and miss, but Margot Robbie really shines as Harley Quinn, the only version of the character so far I haven't found annoying. Winstead is enjoyable as Huntress, and Rosie Perez and Journey Smollett-Bell, who's really good, both put a bit of power behind their performances with some weightier characterization. Don't know if you can tell by this point in the review, but this is not a weighty film. It's thin on substance in favour of style. It's a bubblegum, candy floss movie with plenty of empty calories. But there's a lot to like in its embrace of anarchy. If Shazam is DC riffing on contemporary comedy, this is more like an adult Saturday morning cartoon. And I'm sure that Birds of Prey will win Harley and the Gang a whole new group of fans. That's it from me, but if you've seen Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn, yeah, it really is a long title, bop, then let's talk about it in the comments down below. I'm particularly interested to see what people who've read the comics think of some of the different characterizations of the characters who are in it. Cassandra Cain and Dinah Lance are both quite different to how the comics portray them, and I think they actually really work for the universe that they've kind of set up for this Birds of Prey to take place in. So I'd love to hear your takes on that. Have a good one. Bye for now. To get one thing straight before we begin, I don't think there will ever be a good Sonic film. There you go, I said it. There's no interest in creating a Sonic film of any worth because Sonic himself is just barely a character, and any existing properties of Sonic of any interest essentially create their story out of nothing because Sonic was created purely as a thin excuse to have a cool video game. So who is this film for? Is it for the adults who grew up with Sonic? Is it for fans of the very clever, I promise, Sonic lore? Or is it for children, the members of a new generation of possible Sonic purchasers? It's unclear, but the film is here anyway, so let's talk about it. I have to tell you that my expectations for the film were low, and they were absolutely met. When that first trailer first came out, the one with the void Sonic, I joined in with the jokes with the rest of the internet, but when a second trailer surfaced, what really threw me was that commenters down in YouTube's comment sections, hellscape that it is, were looking forward to the movie now because the one thing wrong with it had been fixed. What? Are we talking about the same movie? Sonic may not be the worst film ever made, but it's almost completely devoid of interest or value. The film opens with a generic idyllic origin for Sonic where his mentor seeks to protect him by giving her life and sending him to our world. This transpires in about 5 minutes of screen time, and it's so generic that it is explained in voiceover with references to Obi-Wan and Uncle Ben, because only pop cultural shorthand can explain something that vague and boring. Now in our world, Sonic busies himself stalking the people of Green Hills, spying on children and the private time of a friendly couple. Soon enough, he's caused an EMP, like a energy explosion with his new lightning powers. Now, I didn't know that Sonic had lightning powers. That's new to me. My thoughts and prayers are with anyone in an ICU or a neonatal unit in the Pacific Northwest, because you're probably dead now thanks to Sonic. Cheers, Sonic. The US Army sends Dr. Robotnik in to find the source of the energy pulse. He's played by Jim Carrey, who looks more and more tired in each successive movie that I see in him nowadays. Sonic pleads for help from the local sheriff, and they take a road trip to San Francisco because there has to be some sort of structure to the plot, basically. Sonic himself is definitely one of those wee, look at the silly thing, fun characters that you sometimes see in badly written children's films. He's constantly moving from one thing to the next, quipping and never standing still. Now that might sound like a pretty reasonable way to approach a super fast hedgehog as a character, but it also comes across as a little bit selfish. All the problems in the films are caused by Sonic, starting with his genocidal energy attack and continuing throughout his little road trip. Most of the plot wouldn't even happen if he wasn't messing stuff up for himself and for everyone else as well. So it's fun, or at least it's structured and delivered like what a focus group thinks fun is, but it's also constantly endangering people he supposedly cares about, which in turn makes it hard to care about him. The world of the film itself is like similarly without charm. It looks quite cheap, except I don't think it was that cheap. Mostly it looks bland. It's all shown in safe wides, everything is evenly lit, the music is dull, and the style is generic. Dull, dull, dull. The end result is like they force-fed an AI 100 shitty kids movies and shot the script that it came out with. There's just so little to like in the film. I can't imagine it appealing to adults, I can't imagine it satisfying Sonic fans, and I certainly can't imagine it enriching the imagination of children. At best, I think it will be mildly diverting to some of the children who watch it, although I doubt they'll remember it. God, this movie. Anyway, the rest of the movie, and I'm not sure if this even counts as spoilers. Sonic and co hit the road, there's a contrived second act bust-up between mates, here and there's a fart joke. And in the finale, at least a dozen people die. Robotnik blows up a city bus. Haha, wee, zip zip quip. Now I came out of the film certain about one thing. If you're going to move house, use Zillow. It's a simple and easy to navigate website, as our characters remind us when house hunting in San Francisco. Oh, and if all that property searching has worked up an appetite, why not consider a trip to Olive Garden? As our characters remind us the first time it's mentioned, when you're there it feels like home. And as the US Army General remarks near the end of the film, their never-ending pasta bowl really is great value for money. I forgive these obvious bits of product placement because in the end it's me who bought the ticket to Sonic, knowing that it would be an attempt to exploit a commercial property without any interest from the filmmakers in actually telling that story. Who could blame them? If the people who are being paid to be interested in Sonic can't muster interest, there's not much hope for the audience. That's it from another not very surprising review for me, but I would love to hear what you thought about Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Can't believe I'm saying that, in the comments below. And if you're a diehard Sonic fan, I'm sorry, you're probably not going to change my mind, but I'm really interested in hearing your viewpoint. That's it from me. Have a good one. Bye for now. Horse Girl is currently out on Netflix, and it's kind of right in line with my expectations of Netflix. It looks like a low-budget sci-fi thriller, but actually underneath it's far more interesting.
Happy birthday! So what are you gonna do tonight to celebrate?
I think probably I'll just go out with some friends from my Zumba class.
You deserve to have fun.
The film follows Sarah, who is an ordinary, lonely woman living somewhere in America. She works a quiet job in a craft shop, visits her horse regularly, and binge watches a supernatural procedural TV show. But at night, she's haunted by these frighteningly vivid nightmares of alien abductions, and she also sleepwalks. When she starts to experience missing time in her everyday life, it's clear that something is very wrong. Horse Girl stars Alison Brie, who's drawing on some personal experiences of mental health in her performance here. Her grandmother suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and she has talked in interviews about how she kind of had these fears of experiencing that herself, which all plays very heavily into the film, which she also co-wrote with the director Jeff Bainer. Bainer's a bit of a quiet talent on the American indie circuit. He co-wrote I Heart Huckabees with David O. Russell, and his previous movies like Life After Beth and Joshi are both great fun. I actually first heard of him though for a film called The Little Hours, which I think is also available on Netflix, which is kind of this mad nuns movie with Alison Brie and Aubrey Plaza playing some kind of nasty convent worshippers alongside a collection of American comedy actors including Nick Offerman and Molly Shannon, who's also in this movie. All of his previous work then is kind of workably fun and silly, but Horse Girl marks a major development in his filmmaking, I think. The opening of Horse Girl is almost like indistinguishable from plenty of similar American comedies. It has this pastel color palette and lots of small talk, which reminded me quite a lot of Napoleon Dynamite, for instance. And it's also shot with this cutesy 1970s throwback style. There's lots of diffusion and slow zooms. It's kind of easy to dismiss as another retro mumblecore movie like was all the rage about 5 years ago. But as the film moves forward, we're introduced to Sarah's boring life, the difficulty she has making friends, and how lonely she is, really. And then the first abduction sequence happens, and it's clear that Bainer and company are on a very different trajectory to what's maybe expected of them. Those slow zooms become like a threatening device. It's like a low-budget 70s horror instead of a high-budget 70s romance. And that diffusion becomes kind of a key way of telling the audience how lucid Sarah is feeling in these moments. It's difficult to discuss the film without spoiling its interesting elements, but it isn't exactly plot heavy, I would say. It's more like a character piece that looks at Sarah's life and her mental health, and it leaves any other interpretation up to the audience, with maybe a bit of the suggestion that it doesn't matter too much. I'll come out actually and say that I just really don't care for the whole is it or isn't it real discussion and speculation around some films. All of that, does the top keep spinning? Can she really go to the underworld stuff? It's just not that interesting to me, because after all, there's nothing real in a film because it's a film, as Alejandro Jodorowsky would remind you. There's my $10 reference for the day. Even in films where these possibilities are very distinctly teased, I think more often than not, it's just lazy writing. It's letting the audience decide something that should really be part of the themes of the film. It's quite an important thing, right, whether or not it's happening. I prefer it when it's part of a thematic device, kind of in and of itself, like in Mulholland Drive, where Lynch has no interest really in giving you clues either way, and it's actually just a conceit for him to introduce doubles and mirror images to the film. In Horse Girl, I think it's more of the latter. It's kind of a way of taking the audience into the mind of the character. But it's also handled in a clever visual way, so you don't get completely lost in it. It has this clear use of contrasting colour palettes that become blurred together over time, which I think is a really nice visual device. I gotta say, of more interest to me in all of this is Alison Brie, who does a phenomenal job as the lead in this film. Like a lot of people, I know her primarily from Community, although I have also seen Glow, so it's great to see her build on the character work in Glow and perform something kind of really challenging here. And I think, like, one of the things that makes the film really work and why it's so compelling is that Brie is trading off that clean-cut, kind of cutesy image that she has to an extent. Sarah's daytime life is kind of chatting nicely with middle-aged ladies and selling arts and crafts, playing with the horse, getting clearly excited when a guy shows interest in her. And then she can be like manic and despondent, where Brie's eyes kind of glass over and she has this distant look of desperation basically on her face the whole time. It's a clever and intense performance, but it's also like a grounded performance. And she should also be applauded for her script work. The film's plot is essentially quite simple, but it's very layered in terms of how it approaches Sarah's backstory, which is important for a character study. One by one, small incidents kind of uncover the difficulties she's faced in her life, which then impacts the story in the present. Of particular note, actually, is a scene in which she visits a friend who shows kind of clear signs of brain damage, and it transpires that the girl was injured in this riding accident. And then after that, Sarah's attachment to her horse takes on this whole new dimension. It's really clever writing. Now, Horse Girl isn't perfect, and I suspect it will be a frustrating viewing experience for some. Plenty of commenters and reviewers who I've seen online have kind of been expressing dissatisfaction with the ending of the film and its is it real elements. I think the use of like genre tropes that kind of then doesn't have a clear genre payoff will annoy people more than anything else in the film. But in there is this well-observed, clever portrait of a woman struggling with reality in all sorts of ways. It's a powerful show of skill from an up-and-coming director, and it's also a great showcase for Alison Brie's evolving talent. That's it from me, but if you've seen Horse Girl, I know there's a lot to discuss in the comments below, so let's have a chat. Have a good one. Bye for now. Nicolas Cage is back in another wacky horror film from the producers of Mandy and the long-absent British director Richard Stanley, who here is adapting a very famous H.P. Lovecraft story. But is Colour Out of Space any good? The Gardner family have taken up residence in the middle of nowhere so that Dad Nathan can sell alpaca milk. It's a Nicolas Cage movie. Well, really it's not because of that. It's more like a way to get back to a more simple life after Mum Teresa survived breast cancer. All of that is thrown out the window when a strange meteorite lands in their back garden, and day by day a bizarre colour, unlike any seen on Earth, begins to infect the plants, wildlife, and eventually the gardeners themselves. If you're unfamiliar with H.P. Lovecraft, most of his work revolves around cosmic horror. It's this sort of fear of the unknown and how humanity is dwarfed by the immensity of creation. Fun stuff like that. Little things, cute stuff. It's a genre that he essentially created, or at least codified, so he's kind of a beloved writer in the horror community. Now, Lovecraft has his flaws. He's a little repetitive and he's a lot anti-Semitic, but the terrifying emptiness of that worldview has taken root in popular consciousness, with the so-called Cthulhu mythos basically becoming like a major pop cultural milestone. The Colour Out of Space, the short story, is a great starting point for Lovecraftian horror and a good short story in its own right, so it's definitely worth seeking out. The film does a pretty good job of adapting the tone, if not really the specifics, of that story. The colour slowly intrudes on life in the farm, firstly in these sort of subtle ways. The parents are more on edge than usual, the plants begin to have a bit of a strange tint to them, and so on. And then eventually it distorts the entire world of the film with these odd shimmering hazes, a vibrant purpley landscape, and very strange changes in character from the gardeners. But as it gets more and more apparent that the colour is having a malign influence on events, it sort of gets harder to justify why the characters stick around. And I think part of that is that what works in Lovecraft's 1920s setting doesn't really apply so easily to a modern world that has Wi-Fi and smartphones and stuff that's faster than a telegram. In the last third of the movie, the proverbial fan comes into contact with some proverbial waste product and everything goes a bit nuts. Now, here, Nicolas Cage's typical manic energy comes to the fore and he does some Cagean, interesting things. In this case, I describe his performance as sort of a Trump impersonation mixed with Cronenbergian body horror. And despite the constant marketing comparisons to Mandy, the films aren't really that similar. There's nothing here to match Panos Cosmatos', the director of Mandy, his singularly weird vision of what horror can be. But to be fair, director Richard Stanley keeps his hand on the rudder and the film never really runs out of energy, even as it occasionally veers off the rails a bit. It's actually really interesting watching a new Richard Stanley film, which is something that I thought I would never do, or at least was very unlikely to happen. Stanley shot to fame in the early 90s with these two great, relatively low budget features, Hardware and Dust Devil, and then he kind of crashed out of the industry when he was fired from the disastrous Island of Dr. Moreau movie made in the mid-90s, the one with Marlon Brando. That's a story, by the way, that's fascinating and very well documented in a film called Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's The Island of Dr. Moreau. Bit of a long title, but it's available on Netflix, so you can always give that a watch. It explains the story really well. So now that he's back in the director's seat, I think Stanley does a pretty good job of pulling together some relatively disparate elements. The issue with the movie really is that there's plenty of goofy things that don't quite fit. There's stuff like Lavinia's Wicca practice, which never really comes to anything, alpaca milk farming, and the whole of Nicolas Cage's performance. But the overall effect of the movie is generally good, I think. It's a good shot at a Lovecraft adaptation, which, being about unknown terrors, is actually quite hard to bring to screen. And it has some chilling elements and some very clever visuals in it. Certainly it's enough to make me look forward to a second planned film, taking in another of Lovecraft's stories, the very famous short story, The Dunwich Horror. But anyway, that's it from me. I don't want to spoil too much, so I'm going to leave you to decide about what you think about the movie, but I'd love to have a chat with anyone who's watched the film in the comments below, and we could also talk about kind of other Lovecraftian type stuff that people have tried to do. The interesting thing with Lovecraft is there's been quite a few adaptations of his work, but they never really seem to get the sense of what people really like from his writing. And I think part of that is that he's a very characterful writer. It's not just the stories that people are interested in, but the way that he tells them specifically, which reminds me kind of like J.G. Ballard, where there's been lots of interesting stuff kind of made around Ballard, but I don't think there's been very many good films that are adaptations of Ballard's work. So I'd love to talk to you about Lovecraftian films that aren't based on Lovecraft's works. I think Annihilation is a really good example of this, and in fact this film visually reminded me a lot of that, so that's something we can definitely discuss. And I suppose there's that smaller subset of stuff that's technically adapted from Lovecraft but is very little to do with him, because funnily enough, Creepshow's, what's it called, The Lonesome Death of Geordie Verrill with Stephen King in the lead role is actually basically a rip-off of Colour Out of Space. I think they might have even credited Lovecraft on the film. So anyway, that's it from me, but I hope we can have a lovely chat in the comments below, and don't forget to click the subscribe button and the bell next to it if you want to get a nod when my next video comes out. Have a good one. Bye for now. Fresh off the massive success of his 2018 classic Shoplifters, no, actually, let's just call it what it is. It's a masterpiece. Director Hirokazu Koreeda is back with a very different film, The Truth. This film was previously planned to be released in cinemas last week, but obviously because of current events, it's now available on Curzon Home Cinema in the UK, so you can buy it and watch it there. That's not only a nice way to support cinemas in this difficult time, the Curzon chain in particular, but also a good diversion. The big question is The Truth any good?
The house looks like a castle.
It does.
Yes, even though there's a prison just behind it.
Fabienne Catherine Deneuve is an aging film star who made it big in the 60s French cinema boom. Her autobiography is about to be published, and her daughter, Juliette Binoche, comes to visit, along with her daughter and American husband Ethan Hawke. On reading the book, she's outraged about inaccuracies in it, and she sticks around to give her mum a piece of her mind. Meanwhile, Fabienne has signed onto a new film with a bright young thing, an up-and-coming actress. That film is a story in itself, a science fiction piece about mothers and daughters that brings uncomfortable feelings to the fore. So, back to the central question of this review, of any review really. Is The Truth any good? Is it worth seeing? The short answer is that The Truth is very good, while also probably being the worst Koreeda film. There's plenty of variety in Correader's work, don't get me wrong. There's the fantastical Afterlife, which is set in heaven or close enough. Air Doll, which is about a sex doll who comes to life, and that's all contrasted with the very grounded Nobody Knows and of course Shoplifters. He's made some very austere and arty films like his debut movie Maborosi, and he's also made some very accessible, cute films like I Wish, which, if you're in the UK and you haven't seen it, is currently on BBC iPlayer and definitely worth your time. The Truth feels quite different from all that again, probably because it's not in Japanese and it features very famous actors. Well, Correader hasn't always worked with new actors. Kieran Kiki is a household name and she was in 5 of his movies, but in this case these are European and American actors. They're big hitters who I know from lots of other films, and that doesn't always sit well with that immersive, naturalistic style of Correader's directing. It's hard, for instance, to see Ethan Hawke on screen and not think of him as Ethan Hawke, even if his acting is fabulous, and it is. On top of that, it's a film about celebrities, fame, and the film industry, or at least tangentially around those things. It's constantly calling attention to itself and its different kind of production methods. The meta elements of the plot are sometimes heavy-handed. He tends to use the film within a film as a way of hammering home the themes of the movie. It's a fair distance from the subtlety of Correader's best work. So all of that together, at first, watching the film was a bit of an odd viewing experience. It was sort of hard to get used to. But underneath this odd feeling that you're watching something familiar but not familiar, everything that characterizes Correader's work is on display. At its heart, The Truth is built around observing family life with its difficulties, idiosyncrasies, and the warmth of family love. There's rich, humanistic character writing and a wonderfully constructed child actor performance. There's these strong touches of comedy, and there's also this moving, emotional story. And of course, plenty of eye-level shots through doorways. Where would Correader be without those, huh? The film's famous performers are reliably excellent. Deneuve kind of rules the roost as this nasty old screen queen. She's playing her comedy skills to the max, while never really pushing for a laugh, which helps. It doesn't feel like she's doing bits. It also helps that Fabienne herself is a complex and deep character, because under all of that bluster she feels lost and threatened, particularly by this new young actress, and Deneuve is masterful at peeling back those layers to show that off very slowly and methodically. Binoche too gets to play her kind of restrained and angry thing. It's a masterclass in pursed lips and annoyed sighs. There's no denying, of course, that Correader is a sentimental director, really, and at times that kind of gets the best of him here. There is a big drama scene, TM, that revolves around a tense meal that's maybe a bit too far. It kind of tips over into melodrama, but it also pays off a number of character beats that are essential to the film, so I don't know how they do without it. It helps, I think, that Correader's judgment and directorial style means there's a number of naturalistic devices that punctuate that scene, which gives you a bit of a break from the moody French acting styles, which I'm not knocking, it's just its own flavour, you know? Hawke plays this kind of lovely, slightly dim TV actor, and his French is almost non-existent, so the biggest reveals of the story usually involve him looking at his wife, waiting for a translation. So, good performances, occasionally a bit too performed, but mostly held in check. A clever story, occasionally too clever, but at worst just slightly over-explained. A sentimental tone, occasionally melodramatic, but mostly tempered by comedy. Strangely, that reminds me most of all of The Terminal, Steven Spielberg's quiet, relatively small scale and somewhat wacky comedy wedged between that phenomenal ticking clock, cat and mouse drama thriller Catch Me If You Can, and the apocalyptic War of the Worlds. After his critical darling, commercially successful, best yet film Shoplifters, Correader has basically taken time out to make a lighter, softer, accessible, smaller scope film. And what's wrong with that? I think we can all do with a little bit of a break right now. If you're interested on watching The Truth, it's currently available on Curzon Home Cinema in the UK, and hopefully a VOD platform will have it wherever you are as well. It's worth just considering about buying and supporting films during this difficult period for the world and for cinema, and The Truth's warm and humanistic approach to life will hopefully provide some comfort to you during this time. That's it from me. Have a good one, and please stay safe out there. Bye for now. Benny is a child in care with major anger issues. She's tried several group homes, a few trials with fosters, and intermittent stays with her mother. One by one, her violent outbursts and erratic behaviour have led to avenues closing off. She's running out of options. Enter Mika, her school escort, who takes it on himself to try and help with unconventional methods. Nora Fingscheid's directorial debut is an energetic, often quite hectic and kinetic peek into the mind of a troubled kid. Loud music and screaming dominate the soundtrack, and bright flashes of pink denote Benny's loss of control during these particularly hard to handle moments. It's an effective, impressionistic way of conveying her trauma that links disparate elements and kind of moments throughout the film's cyclical structure, where Benny basically tries a new way of living and then rules it out again and again over the course of the runtime. The real star here, though, is Benny and the young actor portraying her, Helena Zengel. She's a great performer. She glowers, screams, and swears. She picks on a wheelchair user, pisses outside her carer's office, starts fights with other kids. In a range of institutional settings, she storms into consultation rooms and immediately spies out the complimentary lollipops and boiled sweets, just like any normal 9-year-old would. It's a big and fearless performance that easily matches the tender and tough adults around her, and the script and Fingscheid's direction gives her the room to do it, which creates this uncompromising world that Benny inhabits. And on that note, if my plot description before sounded a bit fluffier than that, like that this would be some sort of Dead Poet Society thing where nice ideas save the day, then I'm sorry, I feel like I might have misled you, and you should prepare for something sadder and darker. The film is almost unbearably raw at times, and its honesty in portraying a little girl who has, by all accounts, had a really terrible life means that it can be very difficult to watch. There's also some uncomfortable truths there. The film shows care workers who don't care that much, others who absolutely do but are hamstrung by systemic constraints and issues like that, and people whose heroic efforts to help lead to nothing. And then in the middle of all that, there's Benny, who consistently puts herself in worse and worse situations, so much so that it can be frustrating to watch and kind of hard to empathize with her sometimes. And in the end, the film's greatest strength, I think, is that it's an exercise in empathy, where you can see the damage that this girl is doing to herself and to others, but also understand the deep trauma and motivation behind it. System Crasher has been doing great business in Europe off the back of winning a Silver Bear at Berlinale, so it's a real shame that it's going to miss out on a cinema release in the UK. Luckily, it is available on Curzon Home Cinema and BFI Player in the UK, and it's also on Netflix in some territories as well, so definitely seek it out and give it a watch. That's it from me, but if you've seen System Crasher or want to talk about any of the issues raised in it, then let's have a discussion in the comments below. Have a good one, stay safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Gemma and Tom are a young couple looking to buy a home together, and after being invited by a strange estate agent to a nightmarish new housing development, Yonder, they discover it's impossible to leave. Vivarium wastes no time getting to its central plot, with only a few minutes of screen time in the real world before the characters enter Yonder. The film's premise rests on a solid execution of its setting, and Yonder is a fantastic creation. It's this nightmarishly conformist, sprawling housing estate rendered in a sickly shade of green. Even the sky here is different. It seems fake, like a clear, sharp blue with sparse but perfect little clouds that repeat on a grid pattern the same way day after day. It's a wonderful image held up by impeccable production design and cinematography working perfectly together to give the sense of something that's mostly right but just a little off. Things get weirder when a baby shows up. Caring for it is apparently the only way to leave, so Gemma and Tom are well and truly stuck, and as the film carries on, the strange touches of uncanniness become much more intrusive. But to say more would spoil it, so I'll leave it up to you. Vivarium really reminds me of a limited set of films that seem to inherit the ethos and writing of The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and other anthology TV series. All these films tell a relatively concept-led science fiction story with little explanation and often with a somewhat low budget. When I think about this kind of like made-up subgenre, the bigger movies in my head are Knowing and The Box, and then on the smaller end of things, there's stuff like the philosophical thriller Circle and the work of Mexican filmmaker Isaac Esban, hope I pronounced that correctly, whose movies The Incident and The Similars both have striking visual ideas and a very ambiguous, almost kind of dreamlike plot. Vivarium fits more into that slot. It's quite nicely fit in there. It's balancing its not massive budget with these clever ideas and this visual inventiveness. I was quite surprised to see stop motion in the film, albeit in a very limited way. And there are lots of kooky ideas like The TV in the house just shows monochrome fractal patterns. But the flip side of that visual style is that it can feel a bit distant, maybe arch at times. You can't get close to the characters despite the good performances from both Imogen Poots and Jesse Eisenberg in the lead roles. That is, that's what I thought when I watched this at a press screening a month ago. Now, the idea of being stuck in a house for months with your partner and slowly going a bit mad doesn't seem quite as far-fetched. But hey, time makes fools of us all, doesn't it? Underneath the plot, there's a clear effort on the part of the filmmakers to draw parallels between what Tom and Gemma are going through and the rigid rituals of growing up in a capitalist world. Buy a house, have a kid, maybe grow old and hate your partner. I wouldn't call it allegory exactly, it's more like applicability. There's this creeping horror of these identical new builds, the uncanny feeling of a life imitating a good one, but not quite there and definitely out of your control. There's the isolation and the fear of failure. It's all stuff that can be applied to a world driven by consumerism and shunning deviations from the norm. Some of that can feel a bit obvious during the film's very short runtime, but hand in hand with the surreal tone, it ends up feeling less like a lecture and more like a fable, complete with the requisite danger to those who decide to leave the path. So that's Vivarium. It's a cool indie film that will probably provide some diversion for you in a difficult time, and if you buy it to watch at home, you're not only supporting the filmmakers, but depending on the platform that you purchase it on, cinemas too. So you can buy it through BFI Player or Curzon Home Cinema, for example. So let's have a chat about this dense and interesting, slow burn, cheap little sci-fi thriller in the comments below. Have a good one, stay safe, stay indoors, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. I don't know if you heard, but no new films are coming out and the cinemas are closed, so working out what to review is a bit of a strange choice. I could pick something off Netflix's trending list, pay 15 quid for Trolls World Tour, or I could, I don't know, review a random collection of DVDs or something. So when I saw Time Trap trending on Netflix, yes, the 7th most watched film in the UK this week, thanks for the info Netflix, I was intrigued. Not by the cheesy title, and I think it is a very cheesy title, isn't it? It reminds me of episode titles for Stingray, which had such gems as The Big Gun. What really got my attention was the plot synopsis. While searching for their missing archaeology professor, a group of students discovers a cave where time passes differently than it does on the surface. I'm a sucker for time travel stories. I just think there's something inherently dramatic about the idea of moving through time. Forwards or back, I'm not really fussy, and it sounded like it would have a cool explanation behind it instead of a silly machine or magical portal. Well, as you'll find out in this review, appearances can be deceiving, but Time Trap is not without its merits. First things first, we ought to talk about that plot synopsis. It's a little off. There are exactly 2 students of this professor, hunky lead Taylor and sulky Jackie. They're joined by Cara, a blonde woman who Taylor fancies, who for some reason brings along her 13-year-old sister, who brings along her 13-year-old mate for some other reason. Now I can see why this wasn't in the synopsis, because it doesn't make sense. Pro tip. If your experienced archaeology professor disappeared while exploring an uncharted cave system in a wilderness area, maybe don't bring children with you on a rescue mission. Just don't, it's not a good idea. 13-year-old number 1, the annoying little sister, is pretty forgettable, but her buddy Furby is nothing short of astonishing. He is the randiest little kid I have ever seen in one of these movies. He's on screen for literally less than a few seconds before someone tells an anecdote about him having a wank. He calls Jackie my queen and gives everyone these wireless-enabled GoPros for which the password is Fart Factory. Furby is awful, but he's also kind of a hero. He's also intensely grating, but luckily he's off-screen for most of the movie. On that subject, let's talk about the actors. Do you recognize any of them? No, neither did I. The reason that they're all unknowns is because the film is really cheap, at least by movie standards. It looks like a low to mid-level episode of television that happens to have ambitions far beyond its station. That doesn't just show in the effects, but also in the relatively simple cinematography and in the setting as well. They basically just sit in this cave for the whole movie. So with a cast of unknowns delivering pretty unpolished dialogue in a cheaply produced setting, you might be forgiven for thinking that my review is going to be all negative. Well, hopefully you're pleasantly surprised. Time Trap isn't great. I'm pretty sure it's not actually good, but it is interesting. Once the silly setup is out of the way, there's some cool visuals. As they're inside the slow timescale of the cave, they look out to see the sun cycling past at high speed. That's a cool idea that translates into a striking image. Good work, filmmakers. As the time travel elements get more involved, there's higher stakes and better character drama, and then the differing timescales begin to give it an interesting structure as well. And suddenly, instead of a bad movie with a bad budget, you have a pretty interesting movie that's held back by its unfortunately low budget. The two filmmakers behind this movie, Mark Dennis and Ben Foster, have only made one other film. And now, with their low-budget sci-fi that came out in 2017, for some reason they're up in the Netflix charts, punching way above their weight. If it takes an algorithmic quirk to get you noticed, then that's okay in my book. And looking at Time Trap as a second feature, it's really uneven and goofy, and believe me, avoiding spoilers means not talking about some very goofy things that happen in this film, but it does have several marks of quality that make me interested in seeing what happens when the filmmakers behind it get more time and money. Maybe they'll make something with a similar level of quirk and invention, but with the supportive machinery of a developed team behind them. You can imagine that those acting issues could be ironed out with more experienced leads and better casting. It could be more consistent production design and effects work to more fully realize the worlds of their movies, and glossier cinematography could really widen the scope of their filmmaking. Or the studio system will strip their work of what makes it special, file off the edges, and destroy their spirit. Hard to say, but my fingers are crossed for them. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to discuss this oddball, goofy, scrappy sci-fi in the comments below, so let's have a chat. Have a good one, and stay safe. Bye for now.
你在哪里学跳舞的？
美国电影，总有一天我会去美国。
我可以去吗？
当然。
If you've seen Master of None, you'll remember the Parents episode, which explores in a moving and funny way the struggles of relating to immigrant parents. Here, the co-creator of that show, Alan Yang, writes and directs a related story about a Taiwanese man who makes the difficult decision and great sacrifices to move to the US, only to question years later the worth of everything that he's done. Tigertail is a story that takes place over a long time span, cutting back and forward between the childhood and early adulthood of the lead character to his later life as an older man in the US. Now, with all that structural play, the intergenerational story, and the Taiwanese setting, you might be forgiven for comparing this to the greats of the Taiwanese New Wave, filmmakers like Hao Xiaoxian and Edward Yang. Alan Yang is definitely a classic movie buff. The entire first episode of the second season of Master of None is basically an Italian neorealism pastiche, and some of those references must be on purpose. In fact, in a recent video for IMDb, he actually mentions Yi Yi, a very famous Edward Yang film, as a favourite Asian movie of his. The truth is that Tigertail is altogether more conventional than those films, although it has a lot of their sentimentality and their sensory focus. Tigertail opens with this long shot, you can see it behind me, of a boy in a sea of waving grass, and there's also these prominent sensuous scenes of slow touching and long looks. That reference is aided by the cinematography of the film, which is really beautiful. It flips skillfully between this hazy 16mm past and a crisp, cool digital present.
I don't even know
Taiwan
how to
of the
talk to you.
1970s in particular is very luscious, with lots of coloured light and film grain. Yum. Nice stuff. The advantage of being more conventional is that the film is also more accessible. You can come right into this with very little knowledge of Taiwan, its history, or the film movements that have taken place there. The lead character, Grover, is played by veteran Chinese-American actor Tai Ma. You might recognize him from Arrival, Rush Hour, or The Farewell. He puts in a great performance here as the brooding, closed-in older man. It's that performance and the really emotional story that drives the movie, which forms the backbone of Tigertail. In the present day, Grover is having problems connecting with his daughter, and so the kind of crux of the film is tracing how his experiences as an immigrant to the US led him basically to being a distant and strict dad and his realizations around that. But where Tigertail surprises is in the warmth that it brings to that story, by showing him as a young man messing around and falling in love. I feel like that's moving away from the more standard representations of strict immigrant parents, and in that sense the film shows him as a human being first and foremost, with a lifetime of decisions that lead him to his kind of closed-in, emotionally distant present. In response to people who try to get him to open up over the course of the movie, he repeatedly answers them, what good would it do? Unfortunately, focusing so much on his story also leads the film to a problem: its uneven pace and its uneven level of detail. Some elements of the film feel glossed over, particularly in the years where Grover is starting a family, which are almost entirely absent. Likewise, there's very little expansion of the story around the daughter's current life. Very few scenes of her on her own without her dad, and not many scenes of them together either. Both of these issues mean that the film's central emotional arc in the present feels a little underwritten. It's not a massive problem. If anything, it shows that you really want to see more of the film's world, but it makes the middle of the movie sag somewhat, as it consistently references the importance of that story without ever really exploring it. Still, the most important thing for me in a drama like Tigertail is that it can move you, that it makes you feel something, and this film definitely did that for me. I found myself taken by surprise by small moments of tenderness and emotion throughout the movie's runtime, where something profound or moving would catch me off guard. And it's also a rich film, I think, that does a lot to transport you to a different time and place, often through music, but sometimes just through different textures and colours on screen. I think it's a personal story for Yang. He even has his dad as the narrator in these kind of bookend voiceover sections for the film, and I'd love to see more of that kind of stuff. So that's Tigertail, an ambitious, clever, moving drama that approaches big topics in a personal, accessible way. But enough from me. I'm interested to see what you make of this movie, so let's have a chat in the comments below. Have a good one and stay safe. Bye for now. It's the late 50s, and the small town of Cayuga, New Mexico is crowding into the local high school for the first basketball game of the season. Radio disc jockey Everett accompanies switchboard operator Faye to her night shift before signing on to present his show. But when both are interrupted by distorted signals and mysterious phone calls, the pair set out to discover the source of these strange events.
Number, please.
Hello? Is this Lee? Large object holding over my land like a tornado.
The opening moments of The Vast of Night represent the film as an episode of a sort of Twilight Zone pastiche called Paradox Theatre. It's even playing out on a retro TV, complete with Rod Serling-esque voiceover. But as the camera pushes in and the movie fades onto view full screen, it segues into this immediately confident, crisply lit and immaculately realised 1950s world. Everett is holding court at the game before heading out. He's chatting with Faye in dialogue that's incredibly fast-paced and dense with period-appropriate slang and references. You have lines like, "Whoa, cut the gas, Cube, you were a mile wide," abound. The car park is crammed with classic vehicles, and en route to their shifts, the lead discuss that kind of heady utopian future full of fantastical machines that 50s sci-fi was so fond of. But beneath that retro styling of the setting, there's a bold confidence to director Andrew Patterson's vision. The film unfolds mostly as a series of long takes, often as dynamic as the opening. In one bravura sequence, the camera speeds through the town, spanning the entire setting of the film, while dipping briefly into the basketball game where the whole rest of the town is gathered, completely oblivious to what's going on. It's an amazing stylistic touch that really shocks the audience. But mostly, the film is the opposite. It's slow-moving or static shots, with one character speaking on screen for long periods, and sometimes even off-screen. In fact, during one such monologue, the film fades to black, leaving the viewer with the impression that they're listening to an old-fashioned radio drama more than watching a movie. Now, if that sounds dry or pretentious, rest assured, the slick dialogue and striking visual style go a long way towards making the film engrossing, and that slow burn approach starts to ratchet up the tension, encouraging you to sort of lean in, listen up, placing you firmly on the edge of your seat for the brisk runtime of just 91 minutes, which, by the way, I've got to say, love a good film, love a good short film. As the story becomes more involved, the genre elements come to the fore, and ultimately it becomes this really chilling movie with a sort of existential bent, albeit one without any blood or jump scares. It's not a schlocky film, although it obviously has warm feelings towards 50s B-movies and anthology TV, both of which it takes many cues from. But instead I think it's a kind of clever and ambiguous sci-fi story, peppered with this well-researched, well-thought-through historical subtext. The film doesn't feel like it's set in the 50s because the director liked the way the cars looked. It feels like it has much more to do with the historical context of the kind of politics of the time. There's a really strong sense of paranoia that runs throughout the film, and that's very much to do with the Cold War, which was just beginning to really kick off at this point. And then there's also quite a lot around the social mores, around race and how women were treated, that's very much relevant now, and is to do with how much distrust or disbelief there was for those people and their experiences, and it all ties in to the plot in really clever, albeit quite small ways. Now that story is fab, and it's one I won't spoil, although I'd love to discuss it with you in the comments below, but what's really worth noting is the economy with which it's told. Mostly it's second-hand reporting, just like the BBC classic horror Ghostwatch, and even the two very likeable leads get fairly limited backstory. There's plenty left for the viewers to infer. That light plot is really bolstered by the terrific craft of the film, where there's not literally a single wasted minute, and a number of ingenious stylistic devices allow the low and apparently self-financed budget to shine. There's a sense throughout the film that instead of picking an easy, cheap option, the filmmakers instead repeatedly chose a distinctive, creative solution that complements the tone of the movie. So that's The Vast of Night, which takes this incredibly clever sci-fi premise, humanizes it with some fab character writing, and props up its limited budget with stylish and effective filmmaking. The end result is a fantastic debut for director Andrew Patterson, and a triumph of independent genre filmmaking. It's currently available on Amazon Prime, and I highly recommend you go and watch it. It did great business on the festival circuit too, and I would love to see this on the big screen. So fingers crossed, cinemas can reopen soon and we get a chance to go and do that somewhere. That's it from me, but I know that this film has a little bit of a cult following already, and there's a lot to discuss in its themes, its execution, and that ending. So let's have a chat in the comments. Have a good one. Bye for now. Teen metalhead Daniel is excited to go spend the summer in Florida with his dad, but when dad suddenly cancels, sad librarian mum Sue has to try and pick up the pieces.
Daniel seems quite philosophical about it all though.
I don't want to be here, do I? I want to be in Florida, where I'm supposed to be, with Dad.
I think he's quite disappointed, to be honest.
Adapted from a graphic novel by screenwriter Lisa Owens, Days of the Bagnold Summer has mostly received attention for being directed by In-Betweener star Simon Bird. I'm always just a little concerned about debut films by actors turned directors because they seem to end up sort of overwrought, overthought, and kind of over-designed as well. But I'm happy to report that Days of the Bagnold Summer suffers from none of those problems. What Bird does instead of doing that overthinking is he opts for a very simple coverage, frequently just using static singles and close-ups. And combined with the small scope of the story, it's an uncomplicated, unpretentious film. In fact, the overall visual style is more reminiscent of, say, like Napoleon Dynamite, except without the overly confected production design. And mostly there's just small tricks, like positioning the characters far apart, occupying different sides of the frame that's often divided by doors and walls, that help to communicate the story in a subtle way. By standing back and really letting the actors work, Bird allows the brilliantly observed script and fantastic performances to shine. Daniel is a perfectly realized teenager, right down to the competitive, fractious relationship that he has with the only other metal kid in town. He sleeps late, he refuses to hand out CVs, he sits at the kitchen table eating ketchup sandwiches, and he'll only wear black hoodies. In fact, the film begins with a long discussion about buying formal shoes for a wedding, with Sue offering these kind of numerous compromises and Daniel just like rejecting it all from behind a thin layer of greasy long hair. And it just felt almost painfully accurate to my experiences. My main reaction to the film was, oh my god, I've actually said that. You know a script is on the money if you have memories of doing exactly what its characters are doing, so sorry, Mama Webb. Not since Lady Bird had Timothée Chalamet nonchalantly nursing a copy of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States has my dickhead teen self ever felt so seen. Monica Dolan as Mum Sue is a real revelation. She fills all this funny mum dialogue with pauses and stutters, and behind the the eyes, she always has a hint of faded dreams of something else. She gets about as much screen time as Daniel as well, so we see plenty of her life and her conversations with other women, including New Age mum Tamsin Gregg and sister Alice Lowe, in the sort of prerequisite UK comedy star cameos that a film like this tends to have. Speaking of that, a series of interactions with town Lothario Rob Brydon opens up an interesting plotline, one that looks at the resurgent romantic life of a woman who basically considered herself past it. In that way, Days of the Bagnold Summer is pretty unique. There are very few films focused on middle-aged women. There's even fewer films focused on their sex lives, and none that I've seen where they're middle-class librarians, basically. Much more like a Julia Roberts type in Eat, Pray, Love or something. And key to the film's success is that beneath the cutesy comedy, the big dopey Labrador and matching custom-printed Labrador mousepad observational stuff, there's a deep emotion to the story as well. Dolan and Earl Cave, who plays Daniel, always inhabit their characters with a depth of feeling, and that drives the story through much harder than you might expect. There are these bitter arguments and tears shed as well. Sue isn't just comedically exasperated about having a teenager, but she's really desperate to reach out to him and rebuild a relationship. So there are some hard truths about parenting in this, and I think hard truths about being a son as well, which are backed up by showing kind of plenty of the inner lives of both characters, quite even-handed in that way. It ends up being as much about Daniel realizing that his mum is a real person as it is about Sue reconnecting with him. And nothing much happens. There's nothing massive, no big drama or high stakes, but as you watch, you realize, kind of as the characters themselves do, that they're living through a quietly transformative experience. So that's Days of the Bagnold Summer, which is out on video on demand in the UK today. I hope you enjoy watching the film, and let's have a conversation about it in the comments below. That's it from me. Have a good one. Bye for now. Paul, Otis, Eddie and Melvin are 4 veterans who come back to Vietnam to find the remains of their squad leader, and a hidden cache of gold that no one else knows about. The arrival of Paul's son David is the first of many complications as they try to claim the gold and come to terms with their pasts. Da Five Bloods, which is a title almost impossible for a white Englishman to say without sounding like an idiot, is the newest Spike Lee joint, picking up off renewed enthusiasm for his work off the back of the resounding success of Black Klansman. Altogether, it's a messier, more sprawling and uneven work than that film, but nevertheless a fascinating, entertaining and challenging movie. We begin with the old gang back together in Vietnam. As they go out clubbing in an Apocalypse Now themed bar, no less, we're introduced to them as they get to know each other again. All old men now, it's clear that their experiences in Nam left different impressions on them and their lives. Perhaps most importantly, Paul, who is altogether more fragile and more forceful than the rest, frightened and disturbed by a disabled beggar and being observed by old Vietnamese men in the bar. Paul, it seems, never really left the war behind, and Lee draws a direct line between that and his vocal support of Trump. Yeah, this is a Spike Lee movie, so throw subtlety out of the window and strap in for some politics. Paul is a Trump supporter, right down to the MAGA hat, much to the consternation of his friends. He seems unable to drop the racial animus of the Vietnam War, using slurs and VC to refer to many of the Vietnamese characters in the film. Bitter about his lack of opportunities since the war, Paul articulates his political beliefs as a way of lashing out at those in power, a position that's pretty pointedly dismissed by his friends and by the film. He's a fascinating character, and his significance to the film can't be underrated. Despite the fun poke to him early on for voting for Trump, it's a pretty sympathetic portrait of someone who's completely disenfranchised. But at the same time, it's ultimately damning of him, I think. It helps that Delroy Lindo portrays Paul with a real force of conviction, pressing points and vocally arguing his position, while also clearly being unstable and difficult, sometimes dangerous, to deal with. Most importantly for Lee's political focus, Paul is simultaneously a victim of oppression and racism, while also to some extent participating in and reinforcing a narrative of American imperialism in Vietnam. Back to the story. The gang's Vietnamese guide arrives in the bar, and the first of many flashbacks to the war begins, showing the fatal final mission of the squad, when they were delivering a box of gold bars to South Vietnamese fighters. In these sequences, Lee employs a grab bag of tricks, transitioning to a grainy 16mm and 4:3 framing to recall newsreel footage, which also is liberally used in the film, alongside still images and titles explaining their significance, just like in Black Klansman. There's plenty of references to Vietnam's portrayal in cinema, from the the aforementioned apocalypse now, bar to shots of helicopters coming out of the sun and Ride of the Valkyries playing over a boat trip. Most notably in these flashback sequences, the surviving Bloods are played by their older actors, diffusing a lot of the voyeuristic thrill that action set pieces should in theory provide. Instead of seeing younger men run and gun, we see the older men that they become. The combined effects of these techniques is almost Brechtian. It provides these shocking and destabilizing moments that invite the viewer to consider how Vietnam War narratives have been constructed over time in American media. It's really notable that throughout the film, most characters refer to the war as the American War, as it's typically called in Vietnam. I think that's the first time I've actually seen that in an American movie. In these flashback sequences, the squad leader Norman, Chadwick Boseman, is portrayed in this glowing, kind of regal light as an enlightened figure who preaches non-violence and also freedom from racial prejudice, as well as advocating for reparations. In fact, that's basically how he views the secret cache of gold, arguing that taking it from the American government is repossessing it, and that it should be redistributed to the black community in America. There's something of the kind of righteous heist vibe from Inside Man here, but it's tied to a historical re-examination, both from Boseman's perspective in the late 60s, and also from the older men's perspective in the modern day. That question of how the older men continue to interpret these radical political lessons in the modern day, and the perspective of David, representing a generation kind of removed from that, but with its own radicalism as well, is a constant subtext in the political discussion in the film. And while we're there, on the subject of David, after first seeing Jonathan Majors in The Last Black Man in San Francisco last year, I'm very happy to see him here establishing himself as a definite talent to watch. He does a great job of showing the generational differences between him and the older men without resorting into those sort of oh no, I've got avocados instead of a house deposit, millennial stereotypes. Certainly there's a kind of line between their combat experience and his lack thereof, while there's also a lot of acknowledgement around what they have in common, both politically and through their identities as well. The film runs at 2.5 hours and is packed with events. I'm not going to try to unpack them all here, but it's definitely worth watching the movie and thinking through those issues. It's really important to engage with work like this, where black filmmakers take long looks at an aspect of their identity and how it connects with political and historical moments. That's always important, and particularly I think with all of the recent events around Black Lives Matter protests and discussions in the media about racism that are often poorly informed or in bad faith. There's been some great writing on this film, which I encourage you to seek out. In particular, I thought Campbell's review in Empire, which I've linked below, is really, really good. As for the rest of Da 5 Bloods, it's packed full of political discussion and devices, including monologues to camera, montage-like editing of newsreel and stock footage, as well as further aspect ratio changes too. But most surprisingly of all, the plot itself seems to change over several times. The stakes completely alter on a few occasions, and that can be pretty jarring throughout. All in all, it's a very interesting addition to Lee's filmography. I think it kind of seeks to draw a line from the action focus of Inside Man to the political depth of Malcolm X. And it's less accessible than BlacKkKlansman, but I think it works well as a companion piece to that film. That's it from me, but I'd love to know what you think about this film, so let's have a chat in the comments below. Have a good one, bye for now. Artemis Fowl, if you're not familiar with it, is a well-liked young adult urban fantasy sci-fi series about an enjoyably villainous, almost sociopathic 12-year-old boy discovering the strange world of fairies and immediately trying to exploit them through a series of heists and capers. Artemis Fowl, the film, is Sir Kenneth Branagh making a list of what works in those books and then systematically undermining all of it. The film opens with a fundamentally confusing and surprisingly low-budget frame story, both of which are key signs that they were hastily added in post-production to explain plot holes introduced by cutting the runtime as much as possible. Artemis Fowl Sr. is under suspicion for antiquity theft. They're holed up in their mansion, they're unseen, but we do meet Mr. Mulch Diggums, a gruff, gravelly-voiced master thief and lockpicker who happens to be a dwarf. So here's a fun game you can play at home. Think about the range of Hollywood stars that are available to the Disney casting department and who might play such a character. Go on, think about it. Think about your ideal casting for this rough and ready, salt of the earth guy. Have you got one? Okay, great. Well, I bet it wasn't Josh Gad. Yes, notably cuddly, lovable Josh Gad plays hard against type here and falls significantly short. Worse still, the frame story sets him up in an interrogation chamber where he proceeds to explain the entire film's events to someone off screen. So I hope you like his terrible Batman impression, because you'll be hearing it every 5 minutes for the duration of the movie. Back in Fowl Manor and an unspecified amount of time later, we're introduced to Artemis Fowl Jr., the real main character of the film. Frankly, the performance from this kid is bad, but as it's a young actor, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and mostly blame the director and the script. The trouble with this version of the character is that he's not very good. See, I am by no means a stickler for fidelity when it comes to adaptations. I'm not one of those fans who wants everything to be exactly the same. In fact, I like a bold adaptation where they meaningfully change the story to match the medium that it's told in. But in this case, every adaptational change just serves to take something interesting about the original and make it more bland. The cruel and hard-to-love teen protagonist is now like a sweet little boy hero. The mentally unwell mum is just plain dead. The disappeared dad, who's not being there drives the action, basically, is a cozy fairy tale telling thief. Even the clever heist structure of the first book is mostly just treated as a set piece in a newly constructed generic fantasy story that revolves around an ill-defined MacGuffin. All of those changes serve to remove interest from the plot in very clear ways, usually by taking out a character dynamic that serves to introduce tension. Back to Artemis, who is chatting with his therapist at school. He tells him that he's very clever and he doesn't want to follow rules. Thanks for the clear character description, Artemis. I think that's actually your casting notice, not part of the script. This is constant throughout the film. Characters just sit down and tell each other what they think and feel about events that are taking place. It's lazy writing and it's most obvious. So Artemis heads home, finds out that his dad is missing, and gets a phone call from the baddie, Opal Cowboy, who wants a fairy MacGuffin called the Aculus. Butler, Artemis's bodyguard, reveals that Artemis Sr. was researching fairies who are real, and they go to poke around for clues. Here's another bad dialogue trope that's constant in the film. The little dialogue that is exposition-free is mostly cliché action non sequiturs. Butler says here, "Could your father have given you a clue on where to start?" And Artemis replies, "He never told me how to start, but he may have told me how to end." I'm used to dialogue like that in Kingdom Hearts or something, where a line that makes no sense stops and then the widescreen bars come off and I can go and do whatever fetch quest I've been sent on. But to see it in a film is a very sad thing indeed. At this point, Branagh decides it's time to go and see the fairies, so we get a big introduction to Haven City where they live. It's even got an introductory voiceover line from Josh Gad, of course, who theatrically says, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Haven City." Why he's introducing it like that to the MI6 agent that he's talking to in the frame story, I don't know. We meet Holly Short, an officer with the Lower Elements Police, who has a bit of friction with her commanding officer, Root. They're also searching for the Aculos, which we still haven't seen, isn't described, and has an ill-defined purpose. It seems to be something to do with magic, but maybe also alternate universes or dimensions. Branagh doesn't seem to care about it at all. It's never really clear, so don't hold your breath for a reveal, even though it's the central plot device in the film. It's here where the film's casting problem becomes very clear. Gad actually just turns out to be the first sign of trouble. Judi Dench is cast as Root, who is a male character in the original story. Holly Short is played by a young actor the same age as Artemis, instead of being portrayed as young, kind of mid-20s, but older than Artemis in the books. Again, I don't mind getting rid of book stuff, but there's a well-observed pastiche of cop movie tropes in the book. It's about a young female officer being chewed out by and ultimately gaining the respect of a hardened male commanding officer. That's all gone. As I said before, I'm in favour of doing interesting adaptational stuff and widening out casting is one of those things, but if you omit a key character dynamic as a result, I don't know, you should probably replace it with something else. The same is true of the villain, who in the book is a beautiful, rich and powerful whiz kid whose villainous enterprise is initially a secret. Over time, her public image is corrupted, she falls from grace and goes more mad. That's called a character arc, which seems a bit hard for Branagh and company to understand. So here she's just an ugly, shadowy, hooded bad guy. Another bit of unfortunate casting is Butler, Artemis's bodyguard. He's been recast with a black actor, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and I think the guy's performance would work in a better film. It's just unfortunate that of all of the roles they could have recast, Branagh chose the only character whose race is specifically mentioned as being non-white in the original books. Butler is explicitly stated to be Eurasian, a wide set of ethnic groups typically comprising people with European Chinese ancestry, as it is in his case. They say he passes for Russian as well as he passes for Japanese. That Eurasian group is very rarely seen on screen, so it's notable that in a film absolutely crammed to the gills with white people, Branagh's team recast one of the only non-white roles. Not sure I can call that progressive. Anyways, I'm getting completely off track here, which is probably suitable as we're about 40 minutes into the film, which is kind of where I lost interest. Artemis Fowl was originally planned for cinema release, which changed pretty quickly when COVID rolled around. But judging from the quality of the movie, I'm assuming Disney knew they had a flop on their hands and would have rather put it out on Plus anyway. Still, think about the wonders of the new world we're living in. I was able to watch this at home just days after release, instead of waiting 6 years to half watch it on Film 4 on a lazy Sunday. I decided to give up on watching the rest of the movie, and then I went and told my girlfriend about that. She said she would lose respect for me as a critic and as a human being if I published that review. So I did go back and watch the rest of the film. I really didn't want to, but big shouts to my girlfriend for convincing me otherwise, and yeah, I think I was right. It doesn't get any better. No tension builds up. They split the runtime between two unconvincing lead child actor performances, which kind of makes the whole thing feel a bit like a school play. Some set pieces from the book are basically unconvincingly staged, and then the ending quickly wraps up with liberal use of magic, right where a third act would usually be. I wonder if that's what got cut. Bravely, and questionably, a number of plot threads are left open for a sequel, which is probably the best joke in the film. I've seen a number of Branagh's films as director, and I can't help but feel that he doesn't care about his work. At times, Artemis Fowl feels like Branagh watched a few fantasy films, didn't like them, and then did a perfunctory job of imitating them, complete with the glossy drone shots of rolling green hills and the vaguely defined MacGuffin. Which actually, now I come to think of it, is exactly how his 4 film feels, like a pastiche of a comic book movie from someone who feels active disdain towards the source material. So that's Artemis Fowl, which you can probably tell I didn't like that much. It's available now on Disney Plus, and I highly encourage you to give it a miss. If you did see this terrible film, it would be lovely to commiserate with you in the comments below and think about how it could have been better. And before you head off, just a quick note. indietrix is about to hit 4,000 subscribers, and I'm really thankful for all of the viewership and engagement from our lovely community over the many years I've been running this. It does feel like a long time. I wanted to check in with you and see if there's any questions you'd like me to answer in an Ask Me Anything video I'm planning on doing. So if you can think of something that I haven't talked about on the channel before that you're interested in knowing about, pop it in the comments and I'll cover it in that video. That's it from me. Have a good one and stay safe out there. Bye for now. Well, Netflix seems pretty much hell-bent on putting out a mid-tier action film once a month, so in that vein, here's a look at The Old Guard. There's a nice middling intro for a middling film. Charlize Theron stars as Andy, leader of a ragtag group of mercenaries who intervene in conflicts around the world. They're on the side of the angels, at least in theory. They try to save lives and protect innocents, and they're the best of the best. But they hide a surprising secret. They're functionally immortal, with their youngest member just over 200 years old, and they can heal from any wound they receive. That's mostly kept them safe from harm, but after taking on a dubious job, they find themselves set up and double-crossed, with the added complication of a new member being added to their team. It's a really interesting premise to hang an action movie around, and the range of historical backgrounds for the characters makes it interesting too. There's lovers Joe and Nikki, who met in the Crusades, Booker, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, and Andy, short for Andromache of Scythia, who is crazy old. I was surprised as well by how carefully the film reveals that premise. You have a few subtle hints of paranoia in the opening minutes, but what little reference there is to their age and how kind of like they feel about all the wars they've been in comes across as being jaded by war, like countless other action protagonists. And then of course they wade into battle with swords and all the subtlety goes out of the window. Oh well. The film keeps up a good pace with plenty of globe-trotting action. Well, I mean, I say globetrotting. It has that slightly cheap feel of a movie that has bigger ambitions than its budget, and it certainly uses a lot of stock footage to kind of piece itself together. Still, its action set pieces hit hard. It really seems like they spent the money there. They're well choreographed, and they mostly run on rule of cool. It might not be terribly realistic to see a battle axe win out against body armor and machine guns, but it does rock, and that's the most important thing. Now I think of it, that approach actually applies to most of the film, which is generally more interesting than good, I'd say. For instance, after the initial setup, there's a heavy sequence of info dumping on the new team member. We see flashbacks of backstory for all of the team members, lots of explaining of their powers and the kind of limits and the rules applied to them, and so on. It's unwieldy, and the explanatory dialogue is pretty schlocky too. Charlize Theron says, "I lead a group of immortals, an army I guess," and so on. I mean, it's 4 people, as another character points out. It's not really an army. We meet the villain of the film at the same time, who I would describe as singularly underwhelming. He's drawn from that newest stereotype of stock villains, you know, the Silicon Valley genius with a secret dark side. You can tell he's that kind of baddie versus the garden variety millionaire because he has a hoodie on under his blazer. Luckily for the viewers, the cast of the film is great, and their chemistry with each other bears you through the worst of the dialogue and into the punchy fight scenes. Charlize Theron, of course, is predictably good value for money. She rocks this hardcore warrior act really well. And Kiki Lane, previously seen in If Beale Street Could Talk, does a believable job of playing the new kid who's, you know, having all that information exposited to her. But for me, the standouts are Luca Marinelli and Marwan Kenzari as the aforementioned Crusades couple. Kenzari gets this sudden burst of passion in a beautifully written and well acted scene where he has this speech about his love for his partner, and it's just a real breath of fresh air, considering the general tokenism, I would say, around LGBT representation in big films currently. You know, that kind of thing where Disney's Twitter will like trumpet the sexuality of a character pre-release, only for you to watch the film and realize it doesn't figure in the plot or the dialogue, and in fact you have to buy the accompanying material, the visual dictionary, or, you know, an easily cuttable side scene where they might kiss their partner. Boo that, yay this, more explicit representation, please. Now, if you can tell by my relatively light plot summary, the film is pretty much completely froth, but there are a few good ideas dotted here and there. How much of a problem that is for you depends on your approach to the film. In my eyes, it's a bit of a waste of a premise that has lots of potential. But then again, I didn't come to the film expecting subtlety or insight. I wanted cool gunfights, and I got that. Yippee. Looking forward to Netflix's next mid-budget blockbuster. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to hear what you have to say about The Old Guard in the comments below. So let's have a chat about this film that seems to just be like Highlander but with guns, and that's not a problem for me. Have a good one. Bye for now.
How do you keep doing it? I do my job.
Bernadine Williams is the warden of a prison that still carries out death sentences. She witnesses an execution that goes wrong, leading to the dying man suffering unduly. Shaken, she moves forward with planning the execution of another inmate, Anthony Woods, who protests his innocence. Outwardly resolute, Williams's private life is falling apart as she leans on alcohol and pushes her husband away. Clemency was a big hitter at last year's Sundance, with its director Chinonye Chukwu receiving the Sundance Dramatic Grand Jury Prize, making her the first black woman to do so. Despite those accolades, it's taken forever to come out in the UK, eventually working out as a low-profile release that, due to the coronavirus, won't even see cinema play. It's a bit of a shame for this well-crafted, urgently political film. As you can see from the trailer, the austerity of visuals is immediately clear. Stark, mostly static camera angles dominate, compositions are frequently imbalanced, and natural frames divide up the screen, like bars or the edge of a window. The overall effect of that is to isolate characters on screen and emphasize the distance between them. Chukwu's restraint as a director is on display here. She uses the lightest of touches to steer the story and its performances, mostly stepping back and allowing her talented cast to work, rather than show off with clever shots. Now, while we're on performances, Alfre Woodard excels in the lead role, and she's been highly praised for it. That's entirely deserved praise. Although it may seem like an issues drama, in many ways Clemency is much more of a character study for the warden. She's kind of in two halves. She carefully and considerately argues her position in public while desperately trying to remain human in her private life, and balancing both of those desires proves ultimately to be untenable. That Woodard stands out in such a capable cast is testament to her ability. I mean, this is a movie with Wendell Pierce and I haven't even mentioned him yet. It's through the warden that the film's political message is really laid out. Woods, the inmate who's going to be executed, continuously protests his innocence, but interestingly, the film doesn't seem to explore that plotline. It's not really into it. Instead, it very forcefully makes a point that regardless of somebody's crimes or lack thereof, institutionally enforced execution is wrong. And powerfully it makes that argument not through complicated legalese, there's not like courtroom scenes in it, but instead it's made through characters. Woodard's performance shows the mental and moral, really, toll of execution on her character, and Aldous Hodge as Woods, the inmate, humanises the lost value of a life cut short, even where that life was maybe somewhat misspent sometimes. When I was watching Clemency, I wasn't particularly grabbed. It's very well made, don't get me wrong, but it just didn't seem to work for me. Something didn't click. Maybe I'm desensitized to violence on screen, or perhaps the political message of the film feels more distant for me. I live in the UK where the death penalty has been banned for 60 plus years. And maybe it was just a case of festival fatigue. I saw it at the London Film Festival press screenings, and sometimes the cumulative weight of all of the films that you've seen makes even remembering them difficult, let alone acknowledging their impact. I have to admit though that since watching, I have found myself thinking of the film on more than one occasion. Its sensitive approach to its subject matter, the understated, careful portrayal of suffering in Woodard's character, the stark cinematography of the film. Clemency is really an uncompromising movie that's well worth engaging with, so I hope you manage to seek it out and watch it. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this complicated, thoughtful movie in the comments below. Have a good one. Bye for now. Ruth arrives at a caravan park in the dead of night, ready to shack up with boyfriend Tom and work through the winter. But when she discovers evidence of another woman having been in their caravan, a strand of red hair, lip marks on the mirror, she becomes obsessed with the possibility that Tom cheated on her. Director Claire Oakley takes these minimal elements and whips up a compelling, thought-provoking drama thriller in this assured debut. It starts with her well-observed characters. Ruth, expertly played by Molly Windsor, is this complex, intriguing character. She's happy and playful one moment and then withdrawn or tempestuous and angry the next. Her time with Tom is an odd mix of child's play with lots of play fighting, shoving, giggling, and this performative, slightly put on sexuality. The couple's relationship is pretty fraught. Their sex life is frequent, but not satisfying for either of them, and they seem to have some kind of deep dysfunction there. There's an interesting energy to the scenes that they share, where Ruth is kind of happy when she's chatting to Tom, and then the moment that he leaves, the smile leaves her face, and she's obviously pulled into this world of insecurity. They've been in a relationship for about 3 years, since they were 15, and you get a sense that they've grown up with each other, but have also grown apart in quite a big way. And there doesn't seem to be much mutual interest holding them together. It just feels like a force of habit. Most of that comes out in a conversation with Jade, another woman working in the caravan park, who becomes suspect number one in Ruth's quest for the red-headed interloper. She has a bit of a reputation, according to Tom. It seems like rumours swirl around her for no other reason than that she's maybe a bit different to everyone else, and probably a bit sadder as well, it seems. Jade might be the other woman, but she's also the most interesting person for miles around, and so Ruth is instantly drawn to her. That's the setup for what amounts to being a psychological thriller, although there are some very interesting elements that are quite spoilery, so I won't go into them here. Suffice to say that Oakley's biggest win is in the last third of the movie, where she performs an act of storytelling alchemy that really shouldn't work, and yet somehow is the complete point of the film and what ties it together. It's a very clever and well-assured bit of filmmaking. Makeup was created under the UK iFeature scheme, and as such it's quite obviously a low-budget film, but cinematographer Nick Cook works closely with Oakley to create these startlingly atmospheric images at points. You go from this dark, dreary midnight arrival in the caravan park to the bright, plastic-wrapped caravan that's being fumigated in a very kind of pivotal sequence of tension in the later part of the film. With those striking visuals, makeup really punches above its weight, and the other thing that really struck me about it was that versus a lot of other low-budget psychosexual thriller dramas, that seem to forget that they're supposed to be thrillers as well as dramas. There isn't a really slow first half where you're just kind of finding out about the characters and their neuroses. Instead, Oakley has a really good sense of the cause and effect between each scene, and so you really do feel like you're following quite a tight narrative thread over the course of the pretty scant runtime. That's pretty much it from me on Makeup. I can't really go into more details without spoiling it, and I highly recommend that you go in blind on this movie, which you can see on Curzon Home Cinema, and for the first time in quite a long time, in the cinemas in the UK currently. One more thing that's interesting, although I think I'll probably have to talk about it later on in the year when it comes out, is the parallels between this and St. Maud. That's another film that's a debut feature from a young British female director, and it deals with similar-ish themes in terms of having a lot of sensory information in the film, a lot of visceral images, and being a thriller that has quite a lot of kind of social commentary on what it's like to be a young woman working a low-wage kind of dead-end job, and the escape into fantasy or away from bad mental health that takes place during the course of the narrative of the film. They're very different movies, and St. Maud hasn't come out yet, so I don't really feel like I can fully pull out those parallels, but there is an interesting thread to find between them. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to hear what you thought about Makeup in the comments below. So do check it out, and then let's have a chat. Have a good one. Bye for now. Sorry mate, I literally can't understand a word you're saying, but I'm sure it's fine. It sounds great, so probably alright. Tenet, the new film from Christopher Nolan, is out in cinemas now. Well, in some places. Due to COVID-19, cinemas remain closed in towns and cities all around the world. But for now, they're open in the UK, and I got to go out and see a new movie on release for the first time in 5 months.
To do what I do, I need some idea of the threat we face.
As I understand it, we're trying to prevent World War III.
I'm not saying Armageddon here.
No. Something worse.
John David Washington is a spy working for someone, the CIA? I'm not really clear. After dying on the job, he's reawoken and sent on a new, ill-defined mission, seeking out the truth behind a single word: Tenet. That's literally all I can say without spoilers, so if you're continuing beyond this point, then fair warning to you, okay? I recommend seeing the film fresh. If you haven't seen it already, then maybe don't watch this bit, no matter how keen on it you are, okay? Spoilers. You ready? I warned you. Okay, so as it turns out, Tenet is a password into the shadowy world of a temporal Cold War, where nefarious forces from the future reach back into mankind's history, manipulating certain people like malign Russian arms dealer Alexei Sator into doing their dirty work. It's the protagonist's role, that's literally what Washington's character is called, by the way, to fight back and forward. See what I did there? Last pun, I promise. All of this is communicated extremely quickly in a very rushed first half hour. From an opera raid in Kiev, to a tower block in Mumbai, to a restaurant in London, meeting new faces and learning new names all the time, a huge amount of information is crammed into this very short period. My screening also didn't have great sound, which exacerbated that feeling of being a bit lost in the story, and not in an immersive way, in a I don't get it way. Then the film hits its stride with a fantastic set-piece heist in Oslo and begins to settle into a bit of a groove. Here you can watch a 747 ram into a building as a mere distraction, and you start to remember that Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker with a fantastic eye for scope. I've said before that set pieces are a bit of a lost art in modern blockbusters, and I think Nolan's work is the real exception to that rule. He seems to know it as well. Much like Inception's confusing layers and timescales mask a relatively straightforward heist story, Tenet's complicated chronology is hung around 3 big set pieces: the Oslo heist, the Tallinn ambush, and the final battle, which helps the viewer to keep everything in order. And boy do you need it, because I have to say I had no idea what was going on in a lot of this film. I think I'm a pretty attentive film viewer. I read a lot of sci-fi, so this is stuff I'm vaguely familiar with, and I've seen all of Nolan's other films, but I was totally lost about 30 minutes into this. I started thinking about all the times that I've spoken to people who feel like Nolan is so into his own ideas that one day he'll disappear up his own arse. Maybe that day has come, I thought to myself, sat in the cinema with my mask on, fogging up my glasses. But then, just as I was losing patience, the film's reverse chronology started to kick into gear during the Oslo heist, and things started to fall into place. For me, that moment of doubt was a very wobbly moment indeed, and it means that ultimately Tenet's not my favourite bit of Nolan work. I think it treads a tightrope between tremendously clever and isolatingly self-indulgent, and it manages to stay upright, but wow, does it ever like looking down at the drop and thinking what would it be like to fall down there. This problem began for me pretty early on when Clemence Posey had the unenviable task of explaining the central conceit of the film to the audience. Luckily, this section also contains what I think is a pretty good guide for the rest of the viewing experience. After showing the protagonist, that's so convenient, isn't it, the effect of reverse chronology gunshots and talking through what inverted causality looks like, she tells him, "Don't try to understand it. Feel it." And the success of the film for any individual viewer, I think, will rely on their ability to accept that central rule. That's Tenet, if you like. It's good, isn't it? Good bit. Plan that one. I decided I would try and consciously do just that, just feel it, rather than worry about understanding it. I felt confused, I felt paranoid, a bit adrift and unsure who to follow, and strangely enough that reminded me of another film experience, watching Thomas Alfredson's 2011 film Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which coincidentally was also shot by Hoyte van Hoytema. That film also chucks a lot of plot at you in the first 30 minutes and expects you to do a lot of legwork to keep up. It casts its lead in a murky shadow world where allegiances are unclear and the enemy seems to have the upper hand all the time. And it's shot through with paranoia, as any good Cold War film is. So despite all of the obvious comparisons between Tenet and Bond, you know, with its globe-trotting and sharp dude in an even sharper suit, what it really reminded me of is Le Carré. It's got the requisite brutalist architecture with an opera house covered in Cyrillic and secret bases secreted inside a wind farm. Even sunny Italy is offset with industrial areas in Oslo and Tallinn. It's not just the style though. I think for Nolan, all of the tricksy chronology of Tenet is a shorthand into the stale beer world of statecraft. Plans carried out by unwitting pawns are necessary to keep info from the future. Paranoia is justified as just the merest hints of a war to come are available. And removed from evidence, spies operate simply on the strength of their own convictions. Very clever stuff and well suited to a Nolan protagonist after all. For me, all of Nolan's leading men, and they are all men, aren't they, are fanatics of a sort, hell-bent on a single goal through pure exercise of their own will. In Interstellar, it's the will to reach beyond Earth. In the Dark Knight films, it's Bruce Wayne's drive to avenge his parents. Here, it takes on an almost religious tone, an act of immense faith. The protagonist's job is to fight a war without obvious participants or skirmishes. And although events seem to be set in stone, it's his drive that ultimately creates the events he's already experienced. As Neil says, we're just an expression of fate in the mechanics of the world. Now, putting all that analysis and actually, you know, understanding the plot to one side, and I am over-egging it a bit, it mostly does make sense, even if some of the finer causality is beyond me. What you have is essentially a ripping yarn spy movie. Big explosions, car chases, multiple heists, and buddy comedy between charming, dapper dudes. John David Washington proves yet again that he is undeniably a star, effortlessly commanding the film with great passion and a light touch of humour. Elizabeth Debicki takes a role that could be a little limp and turns it into something altogether harder-edged. And Robert Pattinson slides off a run of intense drama roles, really, to play something a little bit lighter, with this impeccable transatlantic accent and a slight bit of foppishness. All those boys in the Batman trailer comments surprised that the guy from Twilight can act will have their worlds rocked by this movie. And watch The Lighthouse, by the way, you Philistines. On top of all that, Hoyte van Hoytema's sterling cinematography is less emotive than Interstellar, but as steely as Dunkirk. And underneath it all is Ludwig Göransson's bombastic score, reading more like an over-electronic Zimmer soundtrack with plenty of playful, reversible, palindromic elements. And if it's a bit hard to understand, well, consider this. The world's biggest blockbuster filmmaker is using his not inconsiderable time and money to make broadly formalist experiments in narrative chronology under the guise of popcorn cinema. And that's a real gift in itself. All of which is to say, Tenet is a good film, and if you can focus on feeling it rather than immediately understanding it, it is tremendously entertaining, and most, if not all, becomes clear soon enough. That's right, like a fox on a trampoline, I was perplexed by the experience, but ultimately I enjoyed it. That's it from me, but with a movie as wild as this one, I know there's going to be lots to discuss, so let's have a chat in the comments below. And while you're here, consider doing a big old subscribe, leaving a fat like, and maybe sharing this with your mates or posting it on your social media to get those discussions going. Every little bit of engagement helps boost the channel. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Yes, yeah, was nice enough. Yes, no, when that's enough.
Hey Will, just wanted to check in with you. I think this backwards bit maybe doesn't work, so maybe we shouldn't have done it or do it. Does that make sense?
How's your mum doing?
Yeah, she's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Shola is an East London schoolgirl whose life is irrevocably changed when her mother simply walks out one day, leaving her in charge of her little brother Emmanuel. She decides to keep her struggles to herself and continues going to school, where she's known as Rox by her close group of friends. But as the situation at home gets more serious, Rox is forced into a series of difficult decisions about herself and her future. That plot summary sounds awfully stakesy and kitchen sink, but Rox's true strength is its keen observation of life. The teen protagonists are incredibly realistically rendered, the result of a long collaboration between director Sarah Gavron, writers Teresa Ikoko and Claire Wilson, and the young actors working at the heart of the film. And it's not just general life reflected, it's a very specific sort of London life, a rhythm of action and dialogue that matches basically what I see on the street every day. The improvised dialogue and workshop scenes make the film feel almost documentary, authentic, especially as the camera tends to be removed from the action, quite observational. If you look back at Gavron's most well-known films, like Hollywood production Suffragette and Brick Lane, that might be a bit of a surprise. But considering that she's made documentary work before, it's maybe not as big as a step as you might think. Actually, in the end, this has more in common with Brick Lane, I think, than any of Gavron's other work, with its slowly developing character study and keen focus on the lives of London characters. Identity is a big topic that runs through the film. Her brother does the Lord's Prayer, well, a good try at it, for eggs and yam at breakfast, which is a special occasion and shows Rox's Nigerian heritage. Her best mate Sumaya is Somalian, wearing a headscarf and dealing with a full house of extended family due to an upcoming wedding, her brother's. One girl in their group lives in a posh house in de Beauvoir. These worlds are side by side but rarely interact. New girl Roche has an Eastern European stepmom, her mate introduces himself as Chinese, Jamaican, English, and Rox asks what he eats for Christmas. Chicken, of course, what else? For all these young people, their identity is newly forged, not just as they come of age, but as they explore life as a Londoner with a heritage including somewhere else, and sometimes a few hyphens as well. You can see that when Sumaya comes around one afternoon to dig Rox out of a funk. Rox teases her for wearing a full headscarf and Air Force Ones. That's the world they live in, mixing different idioms of identity and ultimately forging new identities for themselves. Wanting to define an identity for yourself is a universal coming-of-age theme, but the carefully researched and portrayed interactions between that and specific cultures, heritages, backgrounds makes it feel specific as well as universal. In and amongst all of that joy, Gavron treads a thin line in showing how precarious Rox's situation is without resorting to poverty porn. There's a dwindling amount of money for food, relatives too far away to help, and as her friends try to assist, Rox alternates between leaning on their support and pushing them away. On top of that, of course, Rox is going through a tumultuous time just by virtue of her age. In the first section of the film, she has to use a tampon for the first time, and she's put through a careers test, as well as her new friendship with Roche causing problems in her friendship group. It's a testament to the warmth and humanity of Rox that despite its deeply sad premise and its desperate moments, it's also a vibrant portrait of a tightly knit group of friends. There's a youthful joy to the film that's been deeply impactful to everyone I know who's seen it, and I hope that you enjoy that feeling too. Do please check out Rox. It's fantastic filmmaking. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to talk about this wonderful film in the comments below with you, so let's have a chat. Bye for now.
been a long time. 30 years.
If I see you in the street, I cannot recognize you. Where are you staying?
Taotian, District 2.
You should visit your old home.
Yeah, I'm going to.
Kit arrives in Vietnam with his mother's ashes in a box. He's travelled ahead of his brother to rekindle his connection with the country he was born in but barely remembers. It's his job to find an appropriate place to scatter his mother's ashes. Monsoon is the second film from director Hong Ko, who made the similarly excellent Lilting. Like that film, it tenderly and carefully explores the sometimes complicated intersections in identity. Beginning with the hustle and bustle of Ho Chi Minh City, Kit quickly hides away in a rented modern flat. The stillness and modernity of the apartment is in stark contrast to the outside world. Its big glass windows look down on the old city. That's made all the more apparent in a visit to a relative's flat. It's cluttered, its windows have shutters on them, and its rough walls are lit with artificial light. For Kit, I think Vietnam is an alien place. He has very slight recollections of it as a child, and he barely speaks Vietnamese. What he does remember is wrong, incomplete, or changed. The building he lived in as a child obviously has another family in it. The pond he played around is filled in. With an incredibly slow pace, Monsoon sets out to trace not just a journey of reconnection and recollection, but the actual act of remembering itself. These embers of memory spark behind Kit's eyes as he comes to find the truth of Vietnam and his childhood there. With all this disconnection, there's a pervasive loneliness to the film. Kit is usually on his own, isolated in empty frames, even in a busy city. He seeks out some connections, arranging a date with an American expat through an app. They hook up and a romance slowly blossoms. Through him, Kit finds a community of young people who are linked to but separate from Vietnam and its history in one way or another. For Lewis, the American, Vietnam is a land of opportunity for his business, but also one with a problematic legacy for him, whose father served in the American War. A young woman who's Vietnamese and runs these modern art tours in perfect American academic English accent feels held back by Vietnam's history. In and amongst these other stories, Kit is searching for the version of Vietnam that his family lived in. He's shocked to discover, for one thing, that his father was caught while defecting and underwent re-education. On arriving in Hanoi, he finds the city constantly under construction. Like his identity, it's undergoing these radical shifts and restructuring, and those changes are reflected in Kit. On the train there, a white man carefully speaks in slow English to him, to which he replies in a fluent London accent. It's a moment of realization for Kit. Is he passing as a Vietnamese man? Is that satisfying, or is the stranger's condescension grating in some way? Lead Henry Golding approaches the film with a great stillness. He's not occupied with random actions, but happy to hold a gaze and communicate the inner shifts of Kit through these nuanced looks and body language. His playful, testing dates with Lewis are shot through with political and kind of social discussion. Their sex scenes feel the same way, strangely enough. They're tender, they're playful, but they have this erotic tension in them as well. Lightly, carefully, intimately told, Monsoon holds off on any bold claims about identity, and instead it's discursive, explorative. The film itself actually explains this to the audience, in fact, where in one scene Kit is invited to watch the making of traditional lotus tea. It takes a long time, carefully preparing the flowers and steeping them. The movements of the people working are slow and graceful, and nothing's thrown away. Everything there is of value. That's how I feel about the film. I hope you enjoy it and find it as thought-provoking as I did. I'd love to have a conversation about Monsoon with you in the comments below, so let's have a chat there. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
When you pray, do you get a response?
Oh, it's like he's physically in me. It's how he guides me.
My little savior.
Blood dripping on the floor, pouring from matted, sodden hair. A body lying on a gurney. This is the first image of St. Maud. A disorientating bodily texture marred by pain, presented without context or understanding. For debut writer-director Rose Glass, the priority is clear. Horror is all about feeling. The plot kicks off with Maud, a hospice nurse who comes to work for Amanda Cole. In the film's opening minutes, Maud prays, hangs a crucifix in her tiny, grotty bedsit, and arrives at Cole's cavernous house. Amanda is this tempestuous ex-prima ballerina who somehow ended up in this beaten-up coastal town in the UK. Maud is an extremely devout, nigh-on puritanical nurse trying to deliver palliative care. Despite the contrast between the two, Maud seems to be a little enticed by Cole's life, her focus on pleasure and aesthetics. And as it transpires, Maud's faith is actually kind of singular. Although she's a deep believer, she's also apparently a recent convert. She doesn't appear to attend a particular church, and her ideas about God definitely don't match up with the common Book of Prayer definition. Her experience of faith instead seems to be more direct. She communes directly with God through the universe, entering a trance state that seems almost orgasmic. All of this comes to a head when, after a particularly deep conversation with Amanda, Maud takes it on herself to become her self-proclaimed saviour. Throughout St. Maud, Glass shows a remarkably assured skill in balancing the interconnected themes of the film. It's not just an examination of dogmatic faith, severe mental illness, end-of-life care, or repressed desire, but a careful dissection of the ways in which those things might interact. I was reminded of Julie Kristeva. She's a philosopher who's an exponent of some of the weirder bits of critical theory, and her main focus throughout her work has been the idea of the abject, a mode of communication that sits between the rational world and the physical one, that exists in conflicts between the two. For Kristeva, horror exists to allow us to safely confront these conflicts between our two modes of communication, hence why that genre is so filled with madness and repulsive physical images. For Maud, her faith seems to be a response to some past trauma. Faced with inexplicable and painful circumstances, she sublimates that into a belief into a higher power, which can only be appeased by self-harm and other great acts of sacrifice. The same is true to some extent for Amanda as well. She seems so self-assured early in the film, but is actually terribly alone in her suffering. She's paying a woman to have sex with her and sees her body as rejecting itself as she slowly dies. In their interactions, Maud is definitely attracted to Amanda, who I think kind of foolishly encourages Maud's religious feelings. There's almost certainly some element of sexual attraction from Maud as well, or at least jealousy. And because these feelings are verboten for her, Maud reinterprets them in her dogmatic, self-defined worldview. Amanda must be saved. It's in that tension that the horror of the film really starts to come out, and boy does it ever. So in communicating that story, Glass zeroes in on painful sensory images. There's scab picking, self-harm, vomit, frothing at the mouth, the list goes on. In one scene, Maud carefully places pins in her shoes so that she's in pain every time she walks. That's some perceived way of communicating with a cosmic force through this sort of ceaseless penance. Now, far from gratuitous, this is actually how Glass makes us inhabit the religious viewpoint of her lead character. We feel Maud's pain, see her ecstatic and terrifying visions of God and his interventions in the world. The film is littered with these extraordinary, revelatory moments of faith, as though through what seems to be some sort of delirious delusion, Maud comes to experience everything in her life as having a religious meaning. And you, as the viewer, are fully immersed in that world, one that's simultaneously as small as a bedsit and as huge as the universe, where love and suffering are the one and same. It's a titanic act of creative transubstantiation from Glass, and one that marks her instantly as a talent to watch. A24 is right to market her alongside Eggers and Astor, and in moments of this film, I think her talent surpasses them. Similar praise should be heaped on Morfydd Clark, the astonishing lead of the film. Faced with an unenviable task, I think, in making the pious Maud into a living and breathing character, Clark imbues her with this incredibly detailed realism, making the fantastical elements of the film feel all the more weighty. In fact, in my internal ranking of horror performances, she's right up there with Sissy Spacek in Carrie. And for similar reasons, because for all its twists and turns, the best special effect in St. Maud is Morfydd Clark. Jennifer Ehle also smoulders away in a layered performance as Amanda, carefully towing this line of the kind of self-declared tormentor, seducer of Maud while also sketching out a meaningful and quite tragic character arc in her own right. So, St. Maud is one of the best films of the year, one of the best horrors I've seen in years, and you might not even be able to see it in cinemas because of COVID. In a year with so many bad things, this is of course one of the smaller ones, but I really hope you'll get a chance to see St. Maud in the cinemas, and hopefully soon. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to chat about this astonishing horror debut in the comments below. So stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Hillbilly Elegy follows J.D. Vance as he returns from a life as a law student at Yale to look after his mother, Amy Adams, and in the process thinks about his family's history as a proud hillbilly clan and the role that his fierce Mimar Glenn Close played in his life. Director Ron Howard has made some great movies, but I wouldn't call him a distinctive filmmaker. I don't look at a Ron Howard film and feel like I'm seeing someone's individual vision. You don't see a single clip in a compilation and think, yes, that's a Ron Howard movie. And that's not the be-all and end-all of filmmaking. In fact, I think it's a little bit overrated, but it can help to elevate bad material from boring and bad to, well, interesting and bad. And unfortunately, right from the beginning, you can see that Hillbilly Elegy is one of those boring and bad movies. It starts with a bunch of hillbillies hanging out in the hills of Kentucky in 1997. It's the end of summer, with that lovely dappled golden light coming down through the trees. There's plenty of crane shots and nice big safe wides, combined with an uninspired banjo-heavy soundtrack. If you told me the film was made in the 1990s, I'd believe you, except for a quick GoPro shot here and there. And seriously, when are we going to stop seeing GoPro stuff in movies? Nothing throws me out of a film more than a GoPro, particularly when it's in a period setting. And the usage here is basically unmotivated. It's just a point of view shot from the back of JD's bike. Well, thanks for that, Ron. Thanks for throwing me out of the movie for that important contribution. After this brief moment in the 90s, the film starts to follow a structure where it's about JD in the present day trying to make it as a law student and having returned to Middletown, Ohio, and then cutting back to his teens growing up there with his mum and grandma, Mimar. It begins with JD at a fancy law networking dinner, flummoxed by which cutlery to use and which wines to drink. Now, I'm aware that that's something people do have difficulty with, but it's treated like a huge dramatic thing by the film, which is probably to heighten the contrast between JD's current, rich life and his poor upbringing. But then in the next scene, he finds out that his mum's just OD'd on heroin, and next to that, this sort of pales in comparison. For me, it would be much easier to buy the central character conflict for JD, that he feels his hillbilly family is limiting his social mobility, if he hadn't already made it to being a law student at Yale, which to me seems like a pretty great achievement in and of itself. JD then heads home and we enter the rhythm of the film. Here is JD trying to get his mum into rehab. Here is a flashback of his unstable upbringing. And that's it. That's the movie. No more development than that for the next 2 hours or so. And believe me, everything that you think is going to happen in the film is going to happen in the film. Here's an example of one of those flashbacks. JD has a nice moment painting Easter eggs with his mum, Bev. Her boyfriend arrives with a puppy as a gift out of the blue. Havoc ensues and Bev screams at the kids, then at the boyfriend. Now, Adams is acting her heart out in these sequences, but the performance just isn't quite there. She's not scary enough in these moments. It's more sad than it is horrifying, and I think that's a casting problem more than it is an issue of skill, which Adams obviously has in buckets. It doesn't help either that both past and present JD are badly performed. The older guy in particular is kind of a charisma vacuum. Well, maybe that's unfair. I suppose it's possible that the trouble is that he's very passive in the story. He's just kind of present as events happen to him and around him. And that might actually be how it shook out. As I said, the source material is a memoir. It's based on true events. But that's what adaptation is for. The passivity that can work well in a book with its interior voice doesn't usually work in a screenplay. On top of this staged rhythm of scenes and lukewarm performances, the film is also devoid of subtlety. Early on, a cop says to JD, "Now son, this may be normal in your family, but it's not right." Thanks, Ron, sorry, I wasn't that clear on the themes. Can you run them by me again? Okay, well, in this scene, JD is distracted from homework by an argument, so he balls up his paper and throws it in the bin. The film doesn't so much explore themes as it does take you by the hand to the themes and bash you over the head with them. It's a shame because Howard has proven he can make interesting work, but here he seems unmotivated to pull out distinctive moments. There are some, but they're criminally underdeveloped. For example, in the present day, at a birthday party in Ohio, JD is fretting over finding a rehab spot for his mum, and family friends all intervene with their own recommendations. Now, if everyone in a crowd knows a rehab facility for heroin use, what does that say about the crowd, or the place, or the time of that conversation? And there's a moment for reflection on the ongoing opioid crisis in America, perhaps, but apparently not for Howard and screenwriter Vanessa Taylor, who would rather look elsewhere instead. It's hard to pin down the problem without reading the book first, which I haven't, and I'm aware that it has its own list of controversies too. For what it's worth, I feel like the film tries to cover too much ground and provides too little context. JD has a rebellious phase, his deadbeat teen pals are introduced, feature in one sequence, and then drop out of the film again. And in the meantime, we're offered no context on the history of hillbillies, the social pressures they face, or why their particular way of living seems to end up in difficulty in modern America. The film also chooses to gloss over the racism in that community entirely, despite JD's Indian American girlfriend Usher offering a possible way of exploring that. If the film wanted to live up to its title, you'd think it would, explain more about hillbillies instead of assuming a general cultural knowledge. Instead, we get this laser focus on the lives of one particular family. So it's a sad story, and it's compellingly drawn from truth, but all its events are so heavily telegraphed that it's ultimately a bit of a damp squib when stuff actually does roll around. Some attempts by the story to tie it into a sort of mythic American narrative don't actually land. What should come across as mythical comes across as generic. Now, it's not offensively terrible, but it is basically empty calories masquerading as something nourishing. Without social or political context, the film is basically just one dude's anecdotes, and that story is scuppered by the overly obvious script and weak performances. Well, that's it from me with Hillbilly Elegy, but with such a conversation-provoking source material and such a bland film, I'm sure there's enough conversation for us to have in the comments down below. So get in there and let's have a chat. And if you aren't subscribed already to indietrix, well, I don't know, mate, the button's right there. Maybe you just give it a... That's it from me, but as ever, have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Mank, it's Orson Welles.
Of course it is.
Mank is Herman Mankiewicz, a washed-up alcoholic screenwriter with a broken leg. He's been secreted away to an isolated bungalow to write a screenplay for the new wunderkind of cinema, Orson Welles. The year is 1940, and Mankiewicz is drying out for the first time in a long time. He has 60 days to write the movie. That's where David Fincher's new movie picks up, with Mank and ever-game Gary Oldman laid up in bed dictating this magnum opus to his British assistant, Lily Collins. Following a screenplay written by his late father, Mank, the movie not the man, is Fincher's passion project, a job that came up time and time again but was rejected because of his insistence in shooting in black and white. Well, the blank checkbooks of Netflix are always open to an auteur who wants to shoot in black and white, so that's how the movie is set out, as well as with a mono soundtrack, dry brush title and opening credits, and even fake cigarette burns. You know, the little circles that appear in the top right to tell the projectionist when to change reels. I mean, come on, you've seen Fight Club. Of course, this being Fincher, the movie isn't as old as it seems. It was shot on 8K monochrome red cameras, and despite the opening credits, there's a whole 5 minutes of closing credits as well. Ah well, that's Hollywood. And Hollywood is all you'll have on the mind, as Mank is not only about the writing of Citizen Kane, which, as you should all know, is definitely the best movie ever made objectively, but also it's about Mank's own troubled history in Hollywood. See, Kane, the central character of that film, is heavily based on William Randolph Hearst, a huge newspaper magnate of the time known for his fabulous wealth, failed political ambitions, and exploitation of shallow tabloid journalism for populist support. Think Rupert Murdoch. Of course, now he's mostly remembered for being who Citizen Kane is based on. As it happens, Mank knew Hearst. He was a frequent dinner guest at his sprawling estate, and even had a close friendship with his mistress, Marion Davis, who is a movie star in her own right. If that feels like a lot of background, well, I'm afraid that's sort of inescapable. The film jumps around in time a lot and assumes that the viewer has a pretty broad knowledge of the golden age of Hollywood, not just the movies but the personalities behind them, and I mean the screenwriters, producers and financiers, not the actors. And heavens forbid that you don't know much about the Great Depression or who Upton Sinclair is, because the movie certainly isn't going to slow its breakneck speed to tell you. So if you haven't seen those movies or read those books, well, go do that instead. Actually, that's always a good idea. And while you're doing that, make sure to check out All About Eve. It's directed by Mank's real-life brother. One of my favourites. Anyway, it's all terribly complicated, which is pointed out in a bit of, to be honest, kind of painfully meta dialogue by Mank when he's discussing the script for Kane. It's in the trailer, I think.
You cannot capture a man's entire life in 2 hours. All you can hope is to leave the impression of one.
It's a bit on the nose, if you ask me, but when someone finally takes the time to explain what's happening in the background of this movie, you may as well sit tight and listen up. For all of its running around to and fro and getting lost in the weeds of Hollywood politics, the film shows plenty of Fincher's trademark control and simmering tension, particularly around the actual political environment of the time, and Mank's deeply held convictions about it. In one important moment, a cocktail party at the Hearst mansion goes quiet, when Davies blurts out that FDR's cabinet was selected with Hearst's specific input. The game here, it seems, is always to be in control, but never to say it outright. The outward perception of what you're doing is the most important part of it, a performance. And this is of course a common theme in Fincher's work, especially Gone Girl and House of Cards. For all his failings, Mank's biggest problem is that he always wants to say what's on his mind, and because he's a perceptive guy, that lands him in big trouble, repeatedly. For one, the campaign against Upton Sinclair begins to employ dirty tricks, precisely because Mank inadvertently suggests it. This is where the film's other big threat comes in, a subtext about how important it is that creative people don't allow their visions to be compromised towards bad ends. You know, fake news stuff. But in a film that's already overstuffed, it's a little bit of a shallow note that doesn't get quite enough development considering its importance. It's also, I think, the closest that Mank gets to progressing beyond being simply a Hollywood love-in or an admittedly well-observed character study. Despite its solid performances and excellent craft, it falls just short of greatness as a result. See, Hollywood talking about Hollywood is very good for winning Oscars, and I'm sure that sitting down to watch 2 hours of Gary Oldman doing good old days impressions in black and white will win over the Academy crowd. But for the casual viewer, it's just onanism, isn't it? That's wanking. No matter how well crafted your movie is, you can't give that much import to films. They're just films. On the character study side, I think the film fares much better. Oldman is of course very capable in playing the role. He's a swaggering alcoholic with high ideas and a poor self-image who consistently screws himself over, a really interesting, tragic character. And he's supported by a talented cast including Amanda Seyfried and Charles Dance. But I think special credit for me goes to Tuppence Middleton, who plays Mank's long-suffering wife, Poor Sarah, as the rest of the cast seems to know her, who gets some of the film's subtler and more quietly moving scenes. So as the movie wears on and events swirl around Mank, they really serve to illuminate his many flaws and quirks, and Oldman brings those to life capably and carefully, which leads to the film's most emotionally affecting moments. And between those two modes, classic Hollywood pastiche or character study, Mank sets up a contrast that in the end works against the film. How are we supposed to care about the writing of Citizen Kane, the big thing we're all here for, this slice of Hollywood history, when it's ultimately just a movie? And in Mank's past, he's watching people lose their livelihoods for the sake of some rich guys getting richer. If that's the point, if that's a deliberate trick by Fincher to show the indecency of that, then why devote half the movie to something you're using to alienate the audience? Mank is well worth a watch. Its artistry, acting, and Fincher's trademark attention to detail all make it fascinating, and the zippy pace makes the runtime pass quickly. You should watch it for no other reason than just to be able to discuss the Best Picture nominees in 2021, because it'll almost certainly be in there. But is it great art? Well, actually, let's lower the bar in honour of Mank's self-effacing nature. Is it a great movie? Well, I think that's a question that only you, the viewer, can decide for yourselves. And of course, that is a conversation we could have in the comments below, so if you've got anything to say about Mank, then let's get in there and have a chat. That's it from me, but as ever, I'll see you next time. Have a good one, and bye for now.